All right, Jim, you ready? Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to our Strategic Forces Subcommittee hearing on assuring national security space, investing in American industry, and to end reliance on the Russian rocket engines. And before I get started, I think we all ought to take note today that is the day of the funeral of those 9 families in South Carolina, and it's a real tragedy, and I know our hearts and thoughts are with them, and our condolences to their family and friends. As for today's business, we'll be conducting 2 panels. In this first panel, we have 5 expert witnesses from the industry who represent current and potential providers of the space launch and rocket propulsion for the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program. In our second panel, we have 3 senior government officials who have responsibilities in managing and overseeing the ELV program, and we also have an expert advisor to the government on a recent launch study. On panel 1, we have Tory Bruno, President and CEO of United Launch Alliance, Mr. Rob Meyerson, President of Blue Origin, Ms. Julie Van Kleeck, Vice President, Advanced Space and Launch Programs at Aerojet Rocketdyne, Mr. Frank Culbertson, President of Space Systems of Orbital ATK, and Mr. Jeff Thornburg, Senior Director of Propulsion Engineering at SpaceX. Thank all of you for participating in this hearing, providing your perspective on national security. I know it takes time and energy to prepare for these things, and it's a really inconvenience to come up here, but it really helps us a lot in developing public policy, so I really appreciate your service. This is our second hearing we've recently conducted on space. We are dedicating the time to this topic because of its significance to our national security. Without an effective space launch program, we lose all the advantages we gain from space capabilities. Losing space for our warfighters is not an option. There are key policy and acquisition questions regarding the future of national security space that need to be addressed. As we've said before, I'm committed to ending our reliance on Russian rocket engines for national security space launch. I believe we must end our reliance in a manner that protects our military's assured access to space and protects the taxpayers by ensuring we don't trade on one monopoly for another. The House bill accomplishes this, and I look forward to perspectives of our witnesses on the current legislation under consideration for fiscal year 2016 NDAA, both the Senate version and the House version. Because we are committing to ending our reliance on Russian engines, we must invest in the United States rocket propulsion industrial base. Investment in our industry for advanced rocket engines is overdue. While we may lead in some areas of rocket propulsion, we are clearly not leading in all. This is a painfully obvious fact, considering that 2 of the 3 U.S. launch providers we have here today rely on Russian engines. And it's not just the Russians leading the way. According to online press reports, the Chinese may be flying a new launch vehicle on a maiden flight this summer with similar technologies as the Russians using advanced kerosene engines. The time has come to resume U.S. leadership in space, and I believe the companies before us today can help us do that. However, I am concerned with the Air Force's recent approach and what they may amount. I am concerned with the Air Force's approach in what may amount to a very expensive and risky endeavor in development of new engines, new launch vehicles, and new infrastructure. Congress has only authorized funding for the development of a rocket propulsion system. Launch vehicles are not the problem is the engine. Thank you for being with us this morning. I look forward to your testimony and discussion on these important topics. I now recognize my friend and colleague from Tennessee, the ranking member, Mr. Cooper, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we should approach this hearing, as all others, with a great deal of humility, because I think the bottom line is if we'd gotten last year's NDAA right, we wouldn't even be having this hearing. So we're correcting a self-inflicted wound here. Now, there are many self-inflicted wounds, depending on how far back you want to go in history. It's a little embarrassing for America that we haven't been able to duplicate or exceed the Russian technology already, given the billions of dollars we've expended. But actually, there are tremendous signs of hope, because if we'd had this hearing a few years ago, that's when we really should have been worried, but we weren't smart enough to be worried back then. Now, due to the investment sometimes of our own billionaires and their love of space, there's some amazingly exciting things happening. So we're really just managing this transition. I'm confident we can do it. I wish, and I don't know whether the Chinese with their Long March missile have in fact bought the RD-180, but, or at least copied it successfully, something we apparently have been unable to do. But we don't want to just be held to the past standard. There are new generation technologies that are even more exciting, more capable. So how do we effectively transition to that? Competition can be contentious sometimes, but it's also exciting, and sometimes it brings out the best in us, no matter how painful it is. So I'm glad we're having this hearing. I hope that the net result will be superior congressional performance as well as superior company performance so that we can have assured access to space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair would inform the other members if they have opening statements, they can submit them for the record. Now we will move to our first panel. The witnesses are asked to summarize their opening statements. Your full opening statements will be accepted into the record. And we will start with Mr. Bruno. You are recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come here today and talk about our ongoing transformation of ULA and our journey to replace the Russian RD-180 with an all-American solution for our rocket engine. As you know, we partnered with Blue Origin last year for the development of the BE-4 engine. It is a methane engine. It was 3.5 years into its development, and the engine portion of that effort was fully funded, allowing us to move out smartly on that activity. Rocket science is hard, and rocket engines are the hardest part, so prudence required that I also enter into a partnership with Aerojet Rocketdyne for the AR-1 rocket engine as a backup. That's a kerosene engine. It is at present 16 months behind the Blue Origin 4 engine simply because it started later, and it does require significant government funding in order to continue. Both engines are currently on plan. They are meeting their project and technical milestones, and most importantly for our nation, both will bring the advanced engine cycle technology that is present on the RD-180 to American shores and allow us to regain our leadership in this key technical area. Now, as we do all of this, ULA's focus will remain laser sharp on mission success and schedule certainty. We're very proud of our perfect, on-time, successful record of now 96 consecutive launches, many of which were critical national security assets. Now, in order to do all of this and avoid an assured access gap and to generate the commercial funds necessary for this investment in this new engine, it is necessary that we be allowed to continue competing with the Atlas launch vehicle in order to support those missions and provide the funds that are required to do this. And so I am grateful to the House, and especially for this committee and the work that you have done to correct the situation that Ranking Member Cooper referred to that will allow us to have true and proper competition going forward while we protect our own national security. Now, as we stand here today, the industry has matured to admit a second provider for national security launch. I think that's a good thing. Competition is healthy for the taxpayer, and it is healthy for the industry. I look forward to competing in this new environment, and I am confident that when there is a fair and even playing field, that ULA can come to that field and we can win. So I'm optimistic about the future of space launch. I am inspired by the missions that I have the privilege to be entrusted with, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bruno. Mr. Meyerson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. Assured access to space is a national priority and a challenge that we must meet domestically. Blue Origin is working to deliver the American engine to maintain U.S. leadership in space and deliver critical national security capabilities. Our partnership with ULA is fully funded and offers the fastest path to a domestic alternative to the Russian RD-180 without requiring taxpayer dollars. For more than a decade, we have steadily advanced our capabilities, flying 5 different rocket vehicles and developing multiple liquid rocket engines. We're spending our own money rather than taxpayer funds, and we are taking a clean sheet approach to development. As a result, we're able to outcompete the Russians, building modern American engines to serve multiple launch vehicles. Our recent successes demonstrate that. In April of this year, our BE-3 engine performed flawlessly, powering our New Shepard space vehicle to the edge of space. The BE-3 is the first new American hydrogen engine to fly to space in more than a decade. United Launch Alliance recognized the merits of our approach when they selected our BE-4 for their Vulcan rocket. The BE-4 improves performance at a lower cost and is already more than 3 years into development. Most importantly, it is on schedule to be qualified in 2017 and ready for first flight on the Vulcan in 2019, 2 years ahead of any alternative. Being available 2 years earlier means that there's 2 years less reliance on the Russians. As with any ox-rich stage combustion development, there are many technical challenges. Blue's made conscious decisions, design choices to mitigate risk, and we also have an extensive testing program underway, completing more than 60 staged combustion tests and multiple hot fire tests on our power pack to date. Full BE-4 engine testing is on schedule to be completed or being conducted by the end of next year, and because we own our own test facilities, we can do this much faster. Blue is well capitalized, and significant private investment has been made in the facilities, equipment, and personnel needed to make the BE-4 a success. The engine is fully funded, primarily by Blue with support from ULA, and does not require government funding to be successful. Instead of duplicating private efforts, the U.S. government should focus its resources on developing the next generation of launch vehicles to meet national security requirements. And in conclusion, no new engine can simply be dropped in to an existing launch vehicle. Launch vehicles have to be designed around their engines, and launch vehicle providers are the ones who are best able to decide what type of engine they need. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meyerson. Ms. Van Kleeck, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to be here today to discuss this important national security issue. Simply stated, we have an engine problem on the Atlas V rocket, the nation's best and most versatile national security launch vehicle. It uses a Russian-made RD-180 booster engine. On behalf of Aerojet Rocketdyne and its 5,000 employees nationwide, I want to thank this committee for recognizing the problem and taking action. It continues to be our position that the fastest, least risky, and lowest cost way to fix this problem is to develop an advanced American rocket booster engine to replace the Russian RD-180. With a focused competitive acquisition based on a robust public-private partnership, we firmly believe this can be accomplished by 2019. In fiscal years 2015 and 16, this committee took a leadership role by authorizing funding and direction for the Air Force to competitively develop this engine by 2019. Aerojet Rocketdyne welcomes the opportunity to compete for this effort for an engine that we call the AR-1. Unfortunately, more than 6 months have passed since fiscal year 2015 funds were authorized and appropriated for the engine development program that this committee mandated, and virtually no money has been spent. It appears that this engine development is being subsumed into a lengthy new launch vehicle development and subsequent launch service acquisition. Mr. Chairman, earlier this week, you stated in the press, and I quote, "It is not time to fund new launch vehicles or new infrastructure rely on unproven technologies. It is time for the Pentagon to harness the power of the American industrial base and move with purpose and clarity in order to swiftly develop an American rocket propulsion system that ends our reliance on Russia as soon as possible," end quote. You're exactly right, and we wholeheartedly agree with you. This is a national security imperative and should be treated as such. We have the technology to fix this problem, but we must get moving. With a focused public-private partnership, Aerojet Rocketdyne has the proven capability to develop a state-of-the-art, advanced technology kerosene-fueled booster engine that can be certified by 2019 and be a near drop-in replacement for the Russian RD-180 on the existing Atlas V. Aerojet Rocketdyne is able to say this with confidence based on more than 60 years of experience developing and producing launch vehicle propulsion. We have at hand these technologies as we've worked on them for the last 20 years. We have active state-of-the-art liquid rocket engine factories that are currently delivering engines supporting upcoming national security launches. We're the only domestic companies designed, developed, produced, and flown rocket engines with thrusts greater than 150,000 pounds thrust. Replacing the RD-180 requires nearly 1 million pounds of thrust. We have experience developing large liquid rocket engines on short timelines, such as our nation now faces. The R-68, the first stage engine on the Delta IV launch vehicle, which produces 700,000 pounds of thrust, was developed and produced on a 5-year schedule. AR-1 will not be a copy of the RD-180. It will be a superior all-American engine and will leapfrog Russian technology. AR-1 will be available to any U.S. launch booster propulsion user and configurable to any launch vehicle. The engine's intellectual property will be retained by the government. To reiterate, our nation has an engine problem on its premier launch vehicle, the Atlas V. We must get rid of the Russian rocket engine. At Aerojet Rocketdyne, we believe the fastest, least risky, lowest cost manner to do this is to develop an advanced American engine to replace the RD-180 on Atlas V. This can only be done by 2019 with a focused and robust engine development program and a public-private partnership. Doing so will preserve access to space and reinvigorate the U.S. rocket propulsion industrial base. Chairman Rogers, I want to thank you again for holding this important hearing. These are difficult issues, and each of us at the table has competing equities at stake. On behalf of Aerojet Rocketdyne, I appreciate you allowing our voice to be a part of this conversation. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Van Kleeck. Mr. Culbertson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I have submitted my full statement for the record, of course, and in the interest of time, will briefly describe for the committee how Orbital ATK is working to support United States national security space systems and launch vehicle programs. As a global leader in aerospace and defense technologies, Orbital ATK designs, builds, and delivers affordable space, defense, and aviation-related systems to support our nation's warfighters, as well as civil government and commercial customers in the U.S. and abroad. Our company is the leading provider of small and medium-class space launch vehicles for civil, military, and commercial missions, having conducted more than 80 launches of such vehicles for NASA, the U.S. Air Force, the Missile Defense Agency, and other government, commercial, and international customers in the last 25 years, including delivering approximately 4 tons of cargo to the International Space Station. As the committee is aware, earlier this year, the U.S. Air Force announced its EELV Phase 2 Development and Launch Services Acquisition Plan. One of the key components of this plan, beginning in fiscal year 2015, centers on the Rocket Propulsion, or RPS, prototype program. We believe the Air Force's acquisition plan for RPS is well conceived, and if supported by Congress, will be successful in providing new space launch capabilities that are affordable, reliable, and available by the end of this decade. As both a launch vehicle builder and a propulsion system supplier, Orbital ATK is prepared to support the Air Force's RPS prototype program. Orbital ATK has proposed both solid and liquid propulsion system developments that will support a new all-American launch vehicle family that meets all the specified national security launch requirements, as well as civil government, commercial, and international launch needs. It is true that we are currently using a Russian engine on one of our launch systems, but that's because it was the only one available to us at the time. We had to meet our commitment to the International Space Station and deliver cargo. Our new systems, however, will be developed in a public-private partnership with significant private investment, and we are confident that our alternatives will be ready to support first flights by early 2019. Orbital ATK is committed to supporting our nation's assured access to space policy. Reliable, affordable, and capable space launch systems are critical to ensuring our country is prepared to maintain access to space. Through the program outlined by the Air Force, we believe that U.S. industry is able and poised to respond to this need and will provide the best possible combinations of systems for the future of U.S. access to space. We appreciate the efforts of this committee and this Congress to correct the situation we find ourselves in propulsion development in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cooper, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee. In addition to my opening statement, I have prepared a detailed written statement, which I've submitted for the record. Mr. Chairman, this country's ability to launch rockets without using Russian engines should not be in question. America right now has talented rocket scientists, engineers, and technicians currently flying or developing innovative, American-made solutions to end U.S. reliance on Russia today. It bears noting that there has been a concerted movement towards national consolidation of the Russian space industry and a series of recent failures with Russian rockets, engines, and spacecraft. Having worked in this business for 20 years for both government and private industry, including the Air Force and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, I can tell you that more is happening now in propulsion development in the United States than at any time in my career. What is SpaceX doing? SpaceX today is the largest private producer of liquid fuel rocket engines in the world. The first stage Merlin engine has flown 162 times to space, more than any other domestic boost phase rocket engine flying, including the RD-180 and the RS-68 combined. In the past 13 years, SpaceX has developed 9 different rocket engines. Merlin is the first new American hydrocarbon rocket engine to be successfully developed and flown in the past 40 years, all while offering the highest thrust-to-weight ratio ever achieved. We are investing in a next-generation rocket engine called Raptor, which will be a fundamental advancement in propulsion technology and serve a number of applications for the national security space market. And we have captured more than 50% of the global space launch market, unilaterally increasing U.S. market share from 0% in 2012. With respect to a national engine program, the Air Force is undertaking a strategy to result in not just a rocket engine, but in launch systems. We believe this approach will, if done correctly, benefit the entire U.S. industrial base, properly require private industry co-investment, and meet requirements for U.S. government launches. Most importantly, the Air Force is seeking to ensure that any new system is commercially viable in order to end the current practice of costly and unsustainable government subsidization. SpaceX stands ready and able to provide access to space for the United States with our launch systems today, as well as next-generation propulsion launch systems. In May, the Air Force certified the Falcon 9 launch system to launch the most critical national security space payloads. We appreciate the Air Force's confidence. Powered by SpaceX's Merlin rocket engine, the Falcon 9 can perform 60% of the DoD launch requirements today. We are also building, qualifying, and certifying the Falcon Heavy, which also uses the Merlin rocket engine. Between these two launch vehicle systems, SpaceX will be able to execute 100% of the DoD launch requirements and provide heavy lift redundancy for the first time to the government. We anticipate Falcon Heavy certification in mid-2017. At the same time, SpaceX is developing Raptor. This staged combustion reusable system will not only be extremely powerful, but also versatile, efficient, and reliable, while achieving commercial viability through notable risk and cost-reducing improvements. Raptor will advance the state-of-the-art, ensure the U.S. remains the global leader in rocket propulsion technology, and serve important applications for national security space launch. Importantly, meaningful competition is re-entering the EELV program. With this, we have seen the incumbent make promises to reduce its costs, innovate, and fund new development efforts with private capital. These are good things. Much has been made of a so-called impending capability gap in assured access to space. The only gap that currently exists relates to heavy lift capability. This is because the Russian-powered Atlas V does not have a heavy lift variant. Otherwise, there is no credible risk of any capability gap for national security launch now or in the future. Existing vehicles, including the Falcon 9 and the Delta IV, are both made in America, certified for DoD launch. The Atlas will continue to fly through 2020 under current law, even if no engine or launch vehicle is flying by the congressionally mandated deadline of 2019, there will be no gap. Soon, however, the Falcon Heavy launch system will close the pre-existing gap in heavy lift through internal funding by SpaceX. Falcon Heavy will be certified years before any proposed national engine program is set to fly. I want to close my testimony with some constructive solutions to truly achieve assured access. First, the United States doesn't need more Russian engines to get national security space payloads to orbit. Second, continue working to achieve assured access through genuine competition between multiple qualified providers with redundant, truly dissimilar launch vehicle systems. Third, Congress must properly structure its engine development effort to maximize smart investment. Any government money should be matched at 50% by private capital to ensure meaningful co-investment, and commercial viability must be a key component of the future system. Mr. Chairman, thank you. SpaceX, with our U.S.-built Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, as well as our investments in homegrown next-generation propulsion systems like Raptor, looks forward to contributing to the nation's space enterprise. I am pleased to address any questions you may have.
Great. Great job. Thank you, all of you. My first question was going to be to the companies, do you think you're capable of providing us a rocket propulsion system, an advanced rocket propulsion system that can replace the RD-180 by 2019. Mr. Meyerson, Ms. Van Kleeck both answered that in their opening statement. Mr. Culbertson, I was interested in your opening statement. You implied that y'all are going to get into competition for this replacement engine. Was that an accurate interpretation of your opening statement?
Yes, sir. We certainly are working towards that end.
Excellent. Mr. Thornburg, are y'all planning on getting into that competition for a replacement engine to the RD-180? And can you have it done by 2019?
Through our existing launch vehicles with Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, we can provide 100% of the nation's needs for national security space missions. In addition, we'll continue our investment in next-generation propulsion systems and capability to further increase the U.S.'s position in propulsion development.
So my understanding is you're talking about you can use your Falcon 9 1.1 and Falcon Heavy when it's certified to compete for this mission, but you're not planning to get in the competition to develop a propulsion system to fit on the Atlas V.
We're investing internally in next-generation propulsion systems like Raptor, and we're happy to have the conversation about how we can support the U.S. government. And anytime the Congress and the U.S. government asks, what can an industry provide to service the needs of the country, we're ready to participate in that conversation.
I heard you make reference to both the Merlin and the Raptor. If those, in fact, would work in some way with a launch system, would you be willing to sell those to other U.S. companies, launch companies?
From an engineering standpoint, yes, that's something that we would entertain in SpaceX.
Okay. Tell me, I'm sorry, Mr. Culbertson, you want to be recognized?
Yes, sir. I'm not sure I totally understood your question correctly. We're not proposing a replacement engine for Atlas. We're proposing a launch system that would meet the needs of the country.
Okay.
In response to the Air Force RFI.
That's what you had me excited for a minute there. I want a new engine. I don't want a new rocket. That we want something to replace the RD-180 and to, if not be a drop-in fit on the Atlas V, something that doesn't require a whole lot of modifications to work on the Atlas V. I understand all of y'all like what you've got, and I know Mr. Bruno wants a new rocket, a launch system. That's awesome, as long as we're not paying for it. We want an engine to be able to get our critical missions into space in a timely fashion. And 2019, as you know, is a critical time for us. Well, let me now go back to the two people I know are going to compete for it, Mr. Meyerson and Ms. Van Kleeck. Will the cost, and start with Mr. Meyerson, will the cost of your engine be comparable to what we're currently paying for the RD-180?
According to our customer at ULA, we understand it is. It's comparable or better than what's being the RD-180.
Ms. Van Kleeck.
Yes, sir. We've designed the AR-1 to be at or below the price point of the RD-180.
Okay. I want to stay with you, Ms. Van Kleeck, for a minute. Mr. Bruno, in his opening statement, made reference to the fact that you were 16 months behind Blue Origin in your development of your engine. Can you address that observation, and what does he mean by that?
Well, I don't have my competitor's schedule, so I can't say for certain where the 16 months comes from. What I can say is we will be certified by 2019. We're very confident about that. We've spent 20 years developing this technology from the Russians, that was pioneered by the Russians. We have the factories, we have a schedule. We will be testing full-scale engines in the beginning of 2017. We will provide a full engine set to ULA in 2018, and we will complete certification in 2019.
2018 or 2019?
We will complete certification of the engine in 2019.
Mr. Meyerson, do you believe, tell us what your schedule is. When do you think you will complete certification?
We believe the engine will be qualified in 2017 and certified for flight on the Vulcan in 2019, or ready for the first flight on the Vulcan in 2019, with certification of the system coming after. We've been working at this for more than 3 years, and we have the facilities and the people and processes and equipment in place to do so. So we have high confidence in our schedule. We're testing hardware now. We're testing today. So the confidence, the level of data is well ahead of any alternative. So that's what gives us the confidence in our schedule.
Now, you made reference to the Vulcan in your opening statement, and I know Mr. Bruno really wants to have a Vulcan launch system.
Yes.
We're interested in the Atlas, or I am, in my questioning. Will your engine work on the Atlas with modifications, and how significant modifications would it take?
So our engine runs in liquid oxygen and liquefied natural gas. So no, as the Atlas is designed, it will not integrate with the Atlas. It
So
requires.
we would have to have a new launch system.
That is right.
Okay. Mr. Bruno, tell me, let's talk about this Vulcan system. Tell me where that came from and when you see that happening, and how does that play into what we're doing right now, given our previous testimony and my comments publicly and our conversations privately. I feel very strongly, I just want a replacement for the RD-180. Why are we talking about the Vulcan?
Certainly. Well, Vulcan really refers to a series of evolutions to the Atlas that takes several years to accomplish. The first step in that evolution is simply replacing the engine that is on the Atlas. So whether it's an AR-1 or a BE-4, that Atlas with that new engine would be called Vulcan, and it would still have the Atlas upper stage, Atlas fairings, Atlas strap-ons. It's essentially an Atlas with a new engine. And if I might take a moment, I would like to expand on my colleagues' answers. I think they were far too modest when they responded to your question relative to the cost of their engines. So first, understanding that there is no such thing as an RD-180 drop-in replacement. We are not at this time capable of replicating the performance and thrust level of the RD-180. What they are talking about is providing a pair of engines that would replace the single RD-180. That pair of engines we expect to be upwards of 35% less expensive than a single RD-180. So while the performance of the engine is only first generation and lagging what the RD-180 has, the manufacturing technology is a giant leap ahead.
We'll get back to you on my next round of questions, but I want to turn to my friend now from Tennessee, the ranking member, for any questions he may have.
Thank you. I appreciate the expertise on this panel, and I appreciate my friendship with the chairman. I'm a little worried that we're pursuing a unicorn here, because I think Mr. Bruno just said there is no such thing as a replacement for the RD-180 engine. There is no drop-in equivalent. And we're kind of fooling ourselves if we think there could be, at least in the reasonable future. Now, there are some, workarounds, replacements, and there's certainly new launch systems. So, continuing the theme of my opening statement, I think our first rule should be first, do no harm, because we wouldn't even be here if we'd gotten the language right in last year's NDAA. So I'm not a technical expert. I'm certainly not a rocket scientist, but it seems to be that in this testimony there's some remarkable differences. First of all, I regret it's a little bit unfair. The witnesses are at least 3-to-1, against SpaceX, and I'm not sure that's fair. Perhaps we should have given Mr. Thornburg 3 times the time. It may be 3.5-to-1 against, but he more than held his own. And it should be exciting for all Americans that we have billionaires and entrepreneurs who are willing to devote so much of their resources to coming up with new and apparently more efficient solutions. But the factual question, is there a gap? It seems to me that we need at least 9 RD-180s. We may need 29. We may need more than 29. And meanwhile, a lot of what you hear on the Hill is a lot of bad-mouthing of the Russians, and there's plenty of reason to badmouth at least their leaders. But while we're dependent on the RD-180, it may not be the smartest thing strategically to badmouth the source. Now, hopefully we can overcome this gap, and Mr. Thornburg's testimony is that the real gap is the premature decision to retire the Delta medium. So there you don't blame the Russians, you blame us. Or the gap could be Air Force dragging their feet to certify the new Falcon Heavy, and certainly there are a lot of worthy and important requirements in certification. 3 required successful launches, lots of things. I loved Mr. Culbertson's quote of Werner von Braun when he said, "We can lick gravity, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming." What Congress is really good at is paperwork and putting in artificial requirements that oftentimes impede the private sector's ability to innovate. I get worried that when it comes to a drop-in engine, you're talking about my beloved old Chevrolet Impala and trying to find a new V8 you can put in the old vehicle. I want a car that'll work, not just an engine that will perform. And when we talk about assured access to space, we want a vehicle that can get our payloads up into the appropriate orbit. And it may be that we haven't had enough discussion in this panel of appropriate orbits, and maybe we can't do that in an open setting, but we have to serve all of our national security needs. And some of those are harder to achieve than others. So I hope that this hearing, and it may take the second panel to do it, will be able to resolve the question of whether there's a gap, and if so, how large, and how best to bridge that gap. And to a certain extent, all of the witnesses are asking us to buy some vaporware because nobody can predict, nobody has a perfect crystal ball. You know, one tends to believe in Mr. Bruno when he says, really, getting realistic, ain't gonna happen before 2021, 2023, maybe because it takes time, at least the American way of doing it. I hope it's not that long, and we should all be encouraged, as I say, with the new methane engine. You know, the Blue Origin is completely amazing, but also the idea of the Raptor is totally amazing. But some existing accomplishments are things we should be deeply proud of. I'm a little bit worried about Mr. Thornburg's methodology because the Falcon uses 9 or 10 engines, and you claim an engine heritage that is able to be multiplied due to the number of engines. It makes me think that if the Falcon 9 were composed of 100 engines, why then you'd have a track record 10 times or 100 times more successful than all the RD-180s. That's perhaps a specious methodology for coming up with a track record. But still, you can't deny the accomplishments because you've exceeded what most people would have expected. But again, our job here is to not stand in the way of progress. And I think the statement of administration policy was pretty on point when it said so often the congressional language, especially last year's Section 1608, gets in the way. So how do we resolve this in a sensible way? We want commercial competition. We want assured access to space. But above all, we have to have assured access to space. So I'm hopeful that the witnesses can help us resolve these questions. And as I say, it may take the second panel, but there seems to be general consensus that no one is talking about a drop-in engine. Because it's my understanding that even the proposed solutions are either 18 inches too long or 4 inches too long, or they're really 2 engines instead of 1 engine. So the chairman's goal, as worthy as it may be, is really not available from any of the witnesses on this panel. Now, the chairman's goal of cost savings is extremely important, but I don't need to remind members of the Armed Services Committee how much money we're wasting on various things here or there. And in the scheme of things, the money we're talking about here is relatively small and manageable. The key is assured access to space. So if any of the witnesses want to correct my impressions, I spent much of last night reading your testimony. It was very helpful, but it also is so conflicting. It's hard to find where the truth lies. So, Ms. Van Kleeck, you seem poised.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. Rockets have been re-engined in the past, okay, in numerous occasions, both in this country and others. You can replace rocket engines. The Air One is a near drop-in replacement. It uses this. Yeah, and I'll explain the differences, and they are minor. We can reproduce an RD-180 in this country. It would cost, in my opinion, more money than it would to develop a new engine. It's a very complex engine and would also cost a lot from a recurring standpoint. And I think it's time for the U.S. to leapfrog that technology anyway. The AR-1 uses the same propellant. It has the same engine cycle, so it'll have a very similar environment, would use the same tankage, would have the same attach points, has the same performance, not lower performance, the same performance. It is 2 engines. We did look at making it a single engine, but 2 engines is probably a better long-term solution for the U.S. because it can be used in multiple other applications in the future. And you can have the exact same physical attach points with a 2-engine solution. It's really where the propellant feeds the engines and how it attaches. It is 11 inches longer, but we've been told by ULA engineers that the length is not an issue. There is length to work with. That will affect minor ground support equipment, but it's very minor. We're talking modest modifications, things that we've done in the past. So it's as near to a drop-in replacement as can be made.
But there are many other issues, acoustics, you know, and Mr. Bruno was saying just because you started late, you're 16 months behind. So we don't know what they will choose in the down select, you know, a year or two from now.
Yes, sir, that's a fact. The acoustics, every rocket engine has a specific signature. The fact that it's the same cycle runs at a very similar operating point, we would anticipate that would be similar.
But there have been lots of anticipations that didn't necessarily pan out. And for assured access to space, we need something that will work.
Yes, sir, but we have been a part of re-engineering numerous launch vehicles over time, and we have been successful with those re-engineering. This engine has been designed from the beginning to be a replacement to Atlas V because we saw this problem coming 10 years ago, and we have focused on that. We understand the Atlas V very well. This engine was designed to interface with the Atlas V.
Mm-hmm. Well, you may have seen the problem 10 years ago, but you're 16 months behind right now, even Blue Origin and some of these other things. So that puts us in a tough spot. We have to measure the gap and figure out how to fill the gap.
You know, whether we're, again, we feel we can meet 2019, whether we're 16 months behind or not, one would have to look at the details of these schedules and the different milestones to really come, you know, to that. I have not seen that.
Mr. Chairman, I think my time has more than expired. Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the concerns I have is when you consider the House's position and the Senate's position on RD-180s, our positions are different. And I've heard that ULA is interested in developing the Vulcan to the extent that they have a certain number of RD-180s available for the future. And if we don't have that certain number, then they're not interested in developing the Vulcan. My question for you, Mr. Bruno, is what happens if the Senate doesn't come the direction of the House? In that case, what happens to the Vulcan and what's your backup plan?
So either engine path that has just been discussed requires significant investment on the part of ULA. Without the continued revenue generation of the Atlas until that new American engine is available, we will lack the funds to be able to accomplish that activity. Without that, we are entering into a marketplace where the Air Force market has declined and is incapable of supporting two providers. Now, the good news is the overall lift market is large enough to support both of us, both the new entrant and us and the other traditional suppliers. But in order to be a viable economic in that entity in that environment, we need to be able to effectively compete for civil and commercial missions in addition to competing for national security space missions. Without that lower cost rocket and without the investment required to get there, we're simply not economically viable in that window.
You indicated that with the commercial launches, in addition to the military launches, that there would be economic viability for multiple providers, and it looks like even, you know, we might get a third provider with Orbital ATK potentially participating. That being the case, is there a reason ULA couldn't get private capital to support the investment?
It's unlikely that the capital markets would look at this uncertain investment environment any more favorably than our parents do. So investment really dislikes and avoids uncertainty. And as we sit here today, it's very uncertain whether the Atlas will even be available to fly during the period between the end of its current contracts and the availability of the new rocket engine. So that leaves a multi-year period of time when we have no product to bring to the marketplace. Not very likely I could attract money from capital markets for that.
Mr. Culbertson, does Orbital ATK agree with that position, that it's not worth the investment if there's not more RD-180 engines? Obviously, you guys are doing it without the RD-180 engine.
I can't really comment on ULA's position on this. We do see a market out there, but it's still pretty slim in the classes we're discussing here. We actually are working with ULA to continue to supply cargo to the International Space Station. After we had the accident, they, SpaceX, and a couple of other companies stepped forward and said, we can give you a ride. And we have contracted with them on a commercial basis to do that. So we are sort of the beginning of their commercial market to continue to fly. But we also are continuing to develop our own systems to fly not only to the space station, but to fly national security missions.
Mr. Thornburg, when you think about the commercial market with the EELV program, is the market big enough, and for how many providers? And clearly, you guys are already making the investment privately.
I would also say that, you know, as an engineer, I'm not necessarily studying the markets, but I can say that SpaceX, you know, believes we can be very competitive across the market. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we've recaptured for the United States 50% of the launch market share. So certainly, with more cost-effective launch solutions, the market does open up.
And for Mr. Bruno, you would know that the United States and we as members of Congress, we want to make sure we have assured access to space, which means we need multiple launch service providers for the EELV program. That being the case, you know, your investors have got to understand that it is not in our interest as a nation to have two providers and one of them go out of business and end up with a monopoly, which means there's going to be some level of security. Would you agree with that? And are your investors, your parents, aware of that?
The only data I have to operate on at the moment is the forecast that the government has provided for the space lift that occurs in that window of time. And it's important to remember that we're the ride for national security assets. They're recapitalized in waves. So we are currently recapitalizing a set of national security satellites that are well past their design life. That's going to complete in a short number of years. There'll be a long trough until the new assets run out of life, and then they'll be recapitalized. So it's very cyclic. What has been forecasted to us by the government, and it's a pretty sound forecast because we can see the satellites in the pipeline being designed and built, is that that marketplace drops from about 8 to 10 a year to 5, and then that will be divided between at least 2 providers, so 2 or 3, and that's not a sustainable economic model if you do not also have access to civil and commercial markets.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Bruno, congratulations for an outstanding record of success. Jeff Bezos, founder of Blue Origin and Amazon, said, quote, ULA has put a satellite into orbit almost every month for the past 8 years. They're the most reliable launch provider in history, and their record of success is astonishing, unquote. I'm proud of that ULA is headquartered in Colorado. I'm fully confident ULA will remain very competitive in the future. You enjoyed an exclusive contract because of your competence, but I want to ask you, what exactly can Congress do to ensure that across the board we have created an environment that promotes innovation while not unfairly tipping the playing field towards or away from any potential provider?
Certainly. But first, I have to observe that that comment reveals that Mr. Bezos is obviously a very intelligent man. So in order to have a fair and even competitive playing field that is healthy and in the interest of the government and good for industry, it's important, of course, that the participants in that competition are able to bring competitive products to the marketplace. That's why we need continued access to Atlas. In addition to that, the competition itself needs to be fair and even. So we must be held to the same technical standards in terms of the performance and the missions that we're able to fly, as well as the contracting requirements. So today the ULA is required to perform to what's called FAR Part 15, which are a set of very complex and sophisticated acquisition regulations. They require for us to provide elaborate, extensive, and expensive financial recording, tracking, and reporting systems. Our competitor in a commercial marketplace does not. And so all of these elements have to be leveled. And then I would also advise the government that for national security missions, for which our nation's safety depends and warfighters' lives are at risk, that a low-price, technically acceptable type of priced shootout is not an appropriate methodology. You wouldn't buy your car that way, you wouldn't buy your home that way, and our soldiers' lives should not be dependent upon it. So when competing and when making selections, they should consider cost equally balanced with technical performance, reliability, and schedule certainty. Remember I mentioned that the assets being recapitalized are generally beyond their design life. There is an urgency to replacing them as soon as possible. That too should be considered.
Thank you. Ms. Thornburg, congratulations on successful certification of the Falcon 9. In March, Mrs. Shotwell testified in this committee that you have DCAA auditors doing manufacturing audits right now, and your cost and your rates have been audited. Was that testimony correct? And can you briefly describe the frequency and extent of the DCAA audits for that SpaceX undergoes, and the number of DCAA personnel resident at SpaceX facilities?
To your first question, was her testimony correct? I believe yes. The answer to that is yes. With regards to the questions about DCA audit and frequency, in my position within engineering and working engine and vehicle development, I'm not familiar with the frequency of the visits. I can tell you that we're working very closely with the Air Force and the DoD. I'd be happy to go collect that information and return for the record.
Yeah, I really appreciate it if you could get that back to us for the record. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this very important hearing, and thank you for the timeliness of this hearing. Mr. Thornburg, I'd like to ask you about the current version of the Merlin engine that you're using. Is the new baseline, is the full thrust Merlin engine the new baseline for the Falcon version 1.1 going forward? And does SpaceX intend to bid that system for upcoming EELV launches?
The current engine we're flying is the Merlin 1D boost engine. Your reference to the full thrust is a minor upgrade to that engine that basically takes the full potential of that engine system for future missions in the Falcon 9 1.1.
Now, what are the differences between the two systems, both hardware and software? I've heard that there are hundreds of differences. Is that correct? Or?
I can't recall the exact number of differences. I can say that from a technical standpoint, engineering-wise, the differences are very minor in terms of the changes and the upgrades to the engine. It's all in line with our continual improvement of our propulsion systems and overall vehicle systems. But essentially, we're taking the existing Merlin 1D with its present design and performance and taking the additional performance that we have available there and offering it to our customers and to enhance the performance of the Falcon 9 1.1 system.
What I'm trying to get at is, with the changes that you've incorporated, does the previous certification cover the new, what amounts to what I would consider a new version once you've started making a lot of changes?
As far as the certification effort to date, the recent certification of Falcon 9, the Merlin 1D engine now and going forward, the bulk of that is identical. So we're talking about minor changes and upgrades to the system that'll be reviewed through ongoing and future engineering review board activity with the Air Force.
So even though there are an indeterminate number of changes, you can't give a number, you don't think that amounts to anything worth recertifying?
No.
Or reopening
No, and I can comment that, the ongoing dialogue with the Air Force through the certification process has been fantastic. We're working very closely with the Air Force as well as the Aerospace Corporation. The type of improvements and modifications that the Falcon 9 launch vehicle is going through now is no different than improvements that Atlas and Delta have taken on over the years. So we're in line with that in terms of the initial certification and then ongoing certification activities as these improvements come online.
Okay, I just wish there was a little more certainty in this, because you can't even tell me how many changes there are. I guess that's a concern I think we should get to the bottom of. Changing gears here, Ms. Van Kleeck, what advanced technology does the RD-180 use, and why is it important that we bring that technology to the U.S.?
Well, the RD-180 is what's called an Oxford staged combustion engine. It's a closed cycle engine, and closed cycle engines are the most efficient engines that can be chemical rockets that can be produced. The RS-25 that powered the space shuttle was also one of these engines. The Russians pioneered and perfected the Oxford staged combustion engine during the Cold War, and the U.S. didn't. The U.S. Perfected solids and hydrogen systems. So it's a very high-performing hydrocarbon engine. It provided a lot of advantage to the original Atlas vehicle. Some of the things that are in it are advanced coatings, advanced materials. It's very compact, very high pressure. Those are things, particularly the materials, were things that this country did not choose to pursue and didn't develop. And so that is where there is a technology gap in this particular variant of rocket engines in this country.
And Mr. Meyerson, would you agree with that assessment?
In terms of the RD-180 and the importance and the efficiency of the cycle, yes, I agree. I think, if you look back to the time that Lockheed Martin, ULA's parent, and the choice of the RD-180 was an enabler for the Atlas V. That Atlas V rocket would not have worked without the RD-180. Today, I think it's time to take a fresh look and look at a new engine. The Oxford staged combustion cycle is critical, and that's what Blue Origin has chosen for the BE-4. But the BE-4 is the enabler for the next generation of American launch vehicles, and it's the choice of methane, liquefied natural gas as the propellant is one of those enablers. So,
okay, thank you, and thank you all for being here.
I thank the gentleman. To start our second round of questions, I was listening to my buddy from Tennessee when he was talking about his Chevy and dropping a new engine in, and how sometimes that wasn't all that easy because, I've made it very clear my priority is to re-engine the Atlas V. And it just reminded me as he was talking, he and I had the true privilege to meet with an American treasure earlier this week, retired General Tom Stafford, also an Apollo astronaut. And we both visited this topic with him, how big a deal is this to re-engine this rocket? And he basically said, it's nothing. He said, we re-engine fighter jets for, generations, and that's much more complicated than what we're talking about here. And so with that backdrop, Mr. Culbertson, your company's in the process of changing the engine in the Antares launch vehicle from the NK-33 to the RD-181 Russian engine. Is that correct? Considering your current experience, how reasonable is it to change an engine to an existing launch vehicle?
It depends on the background of the engine and what it was originally designed for and the maturity of it at the time that you move forward with it. The engine that we are using in the future generation of Antares launch vehicles, which we intend to start flying next year, was specifically designed as a replacement for the NK-33, which the AJ-26 was based on. So the arrangement of the thrust vector, the piping, if you will, for the fuel systems, the connections, the size of the engine, and the thrust levels were all very comparable to the NK-33 because it had been in development for almost 10 years now to replace that engine on a couple of different Russian rockets. So when we started talking to them over 3 years ago, they were pretty far along on that path already. We did a lot of analysis to make sure that it would in fact be compatible, and when we reached the point where we needed to move forward with another engine, it was the one that was most likely to succeed in our application and the one that was available to ensure we could continue to deliver cargo.
Great. Ms. Van Kleeck, you've already heard some reference to it today in your interchange with the ranking member, and in the next panel, we're going to hear that it's going to cost a significant amount of money to re-engine the Atlas V with the AR-1. Can you address where 200, and as I understand it, you're going to hear it's going to cost at least $200 million to modify the Atlas V for the AR-1. Can you address that?
Yes, I can. We've been working closely with ULA for several years now on replacing an RD-180 in various forms. Like I said, we have looked at this problem over the past 10 years. We have an active contract right now identifying the specific changes that need to be made, assuming this goes into an Atlas V vehicle. We're also looking at a Vulcan configuration. That configuration requires a different launch vehicle. Relative to the Atlas, I've summarized the changes that need to be made, and I will submit those for the record. In terms of the estimate for those costs, I've heard a variety of numbers. I've never heard a $200 million number. The number I've heard for the changes associated with an AR-1 going into an Atlas V are more in the low tens of millions of dollars. I think that cost estimate still needs to be refined, but the type of modifications that are required are very minor.
For the AR-1?
For the AR-1 into
on the Atlas
V
V
vehicle. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Now, Mr. Meyerson, same question,
Can
except the BE-4.
Well, can I add to Mr. Culbertson's comment, his response? The key word was 10 years of investment by the Russian government to develop a replacement for the NK-33, which was developed into the AJ-26. That's the key point, 10 years, and we don't know how much money was invested. The BE-4 is being developed. It's fully funded. We're more than 3 years into development. So this engine is real. There's real hardware to see. It's not a paper engine. So,
Great. Tell me, Mr. Bruno has stated that both the BE-4 and the AR-1 would work on the Atlas V with modifications, one with more modifications than the other. Can you describe the extent to which we'd have to modify the Atlas V for your engine to work?
I think that's a better question for Mr. Bruno. But the engine, when you're developing a new engine, you start with requirements, and the details really matter. Because the BE-4 is so far along in its development, those details are much more well understood, so that Mr. Bruno's team at ULA can look at that and design the right system to meet the national security need.
Mr. Bruno, I'd love for you to visit this topic.
Well, this is an excellent sort of example of the difference between an engine provider and a launch vehicle service provider. It will not cost tens of millions of dollars to incorporate any version of an AR-1. Recall that we started with an understanding that the performance level coming out of either of these two engines will not match the RD-180, and we will be using a pair of engines to do that. The thrust level...
Well, let me stop you there. Would the combined thrust of the two engines be comparable to the RD-180?
Yes, it will. In fact, it'll be larger than the two.
Okay.
In addition to that, the RD-180 uses a very novel thrust vector control system to move the nozzle and steer the rocket based on fluidics that tap off the engine fuel system. That's also a technology that does not exist in the United States, and by the way, one that we do not have an interest in developing. So there will be a new thrust vector control system to go along with that. So when we do all of that, with the new performance point that's required and the new thrust levels that would be delivered, there will be software changes, there will be structures changes, there will be alterations to the pad to accomplish even the AR-1. The number that was quoted was not unreasonable, that I think you will hear from the...
$200 million. I think we're going to hear from the Air Force later.
Right.
You think that's an accurate...
I do think that's inaccurate.
And that's for the AR-1?
That's for the AR-1. I can drive that number down if I am willing to leave the tank exactly the same size that I have on Atlas. But if I do that, because of the lower efficiency of that engine in its first generation, as a launch system for several missions, I will be adding one or more solid rocket boosters to the launch vehicle. And so the cost competitiveness, the affordability of that system will be less than the Atlas today.
So getting you those modifications moves you toward the new rocket system you want, but is not necessary for the replacement engine that we are pursuing, or that I'm pursuing.
It will not lift the same missions. So I think you're asking me, could I keep the tank size the same, take the engine that is made available to me, strap on the extra strap-ons, and just deal with the additional cost? I could do that for the first set within the fleet. So remember that the Atlas is a fleet of rockets, the least capable of which is equivalent to a Falcon. There are much more difficult orbits that we go to. Eventually, there's a limit to how many strap-ons I can physically attach to the rocket because of the way the rocket is configured. Those most difficult missions would suddenly become out of reach of an Atlas in this configuration without a longer tank to carry more fuel.
Okay, now that's the AR-1 we're talking about. Now let's talk about the BE-4.
Yes. So the BE-4 requires more extensive changes to our infrastructure and to our rocket.
So what does a $200 million figure turn into with the BE-4 as the down-selected engine?
It would not be unreasonable to triple or quadruple that number.
So 600 to 800 million?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the other infrastructure involved when we change, let's say we do change to a new rocket. And I'm not saying I'm ready to go there, but what else is required for the launch? Modifications other than just the rocket. Don't you have to change the infrastructure that you use for the launch process?
Yes. So, you could think of it in these pieces. There's the rocket, there's the pad, factory, of course, with its tooling, and then the equipment that we use actually at the launch site to integrate the rocket with the satellite and roll it out. So those things, are more dependent upon the physical size and configuration of what changes we have to make to accommodate the engine. So my colleague is correct. There are far fewer changes with the AR-1 because it's the same propellant, and so the diameter and length of the rocket will be much more similar. Much more of the tooling in the factory can be the same. The equipment at the launch pad can be only slightly modified, and the pad will have smaller modifications. For the methane engine, because methane is less dense, the tank will be much larger. I'll have to replace much more tooling in the factory. I'll have to redo what's called the mobile launch platform that moves the rocket to the pad, and then the changes to the pad are more extensive.
Are those costs a part of that triple or quadrupling?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that was a comprehensive figure. Maybe I missed it, but were you able to explain the difference in the 16 months of lead that you assert that Blue Origin has over Aerojet and their development?
Yes. So both companies are under contract with us. We have, sort of weekly engagements, monthly formal program reviews. We're tracking both schedules side by side. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, Aerojet Rocketdyne started several years later than Blue Origin, and that is essentially the nature of the 16 months.
Okay, thank you. This will be for all the witnesses. Do you agree that the government should own the intellectual property of any investment it makes in a new propulsion system? Now, Mr. Meyerson, I know you're talking about your private money, but if we're going to invest money in it, do you believe that we should own some of the intellectual property value?
I think if the government fully invested in the system, they should own the IP, yes.
Ms. Van Kleeck?
Yes, sir. I do agree.
Mr. Culbertson?
Yes, sir. If the government has invested the majority of the money, then they should, as the law allows, own the IP for it. But the companies also investing should own their IP that they develop to enable the systems.
Yeah. Mr. Thornburg?
I agree with my colleagues in that if the government fully invests, then they would own and retain IP rights, but for systems that are privately developed, they would not.
Now, I'm a recovering attorney, so two of you use the term fully invest. Mr. Meyerson and Ms. Thornburg. What if we pay for 60% of the development cost? Is that something that you believe should inhibit our owning a percentage of the intellectual property's value? Let's start with Mr. Thornburg.
I think it would depend on what type of development we were talking about in terms of the technology. If the technology was an offshoot of something that had been completely developed and invested by the private corporation, maybe not, but I think it would be case dependent.
Mr. Meyerson.
I think the contracting methods, there's public-private partnerships, and there's mechanisms that can be in place to allow industry to invest and account for shared ownership.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns. You know, we've already set aside a little over $400 million for this, and we project that by the time it's all said and done, $1.3 to $1.5 billion is going to be spent in pursuit of this new engine, and as much as $800 million or more may be paid for by the federal government. So it just seems to me that there should be some interest that we have in the intellectual property that arises out of that. Okay. I want to ask the witnesses this, and this is for all the witnesses. Are there clear requirements from the Air Force as we go into this process about what they're expecting, and do you think they're not only clear but fair and reasonable? Mr. Meyerson.
I think, yeah, I think the requirements are clear, yes.
Ms. Van Kleeck.
I assume you're referencing the current acquisition process that's underway.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and there's a process that's well spelled out in that. It does focus more on an ultimate launch service as opposed to an engine, but it's spelled out. I think there's a lot of different paths that particular process can go.
Have we asked that? Okay, Mr. Culbertson, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. We do feel like, based on our experience in both the commercial and the government market, we understand the requirements of the Air Force and what they're looking for, and we do think it is focused on a system that could be developed in a public-private partnership that would give the government the most options for competition as well as success.
Ms. Thornburg.
With regards to the ongoing source selection activity, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on that right now because I wouldn't want to say anything that would unduly influence that ongoing source selection.
Okay. Ms. Bruno, do you have any comment on this? You're not building an engine, but you're going to be buying it.
I believe the requirements in the RPS activity that you're referring to are very clear from the government.
Are they fair and reasonable?
Yes.
Great. Couple of cleanup questions. This would be for Ms. Van Kleeck. Your history is partnering with launch service providers or being a launch service prime when developing a new engine. Why do you believe this approach is not appropriate in this situation?
I think the issue at hand that we're talking about is replacing an engine. And right now we are looking at an acquisition process that's looking at replacing a service or looking at an evolution of that service. I believe with that acquisition, you can get to an engine through that process, but it isn't the most efficient way to do that.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Bruno, as ULA moves forward with a new Vulcan launch vehicle, can you tell the committee if you intend to mitigate your risk by carrying forward both the AR-1 and BE-4 as design options? If not, why not? And if yes, when will you be able to down select the new single option?
I will not carry them all the way until completion. We will carry both until it is clear that the major technical risk with either path has been retired and we're in a position to make a down selection based on their technical feasibility, their schedule, and their forecasted recurring cost. I expect that to happen at the end of 2016. The reason we'll down select and not carry both forward is simply because I cannot afford to carry both all the way.
Great. Thank you very much. Ranking members recognized for any additional questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are 5 areas I'd like to pursue. Some are just context and peripheral, but I think it's going to be important for this committee to understand. In the Air Force RPS, is there a prediction in the out years of payload size? Because I think the assumption is they're going to stay about the same size as they are today, some large, some small. When there's some trends, if we're going to Mars, we probably need to be on the big side. If we're going to do CubeSats, maybe we don't need the lift capability. So all this talk about launch systems and lift capacity, the question is, what are we lifting? And as electronics get smaller and smaller, it could be that lighter lift capacity is sufficient to do the job. I don't know the answer to that question. Anybody have any answers on this panel?
So the standard reference for technical performance remains what the Air Force calls the 8 reference missions. And so they provide us with a set of orbits and payload weight to be lifted to that orbit. Those have not changed as of this date. The most challenging of those orbits require our complete capability all the way to the Atlas V with its 5 strap-ons and its largest payload fairing.
Mm-hmm. So part of it is orbit, part of it is weight, there are various characteristics.
And it's probably important, which is the time required in space to reach the highest orbits, and that dictates some of the technical characteristics of the upper stage. So when we go to, for example, a geosynchronous orbit, if you wish to directly inject, which the government generally does to preserve the life of the satellite, it takes 8 hours flying in space, operating an upper stage, in order to circularize that orbit, something not possible with conventional fuels like kerosene, for example, without elaborate systems to keep them from simply freezing up.
Yeah, we haven't given much attention at all to the second stage problems, and that you point out are very, very important. On the intellectual property issue, it's the greatest source of wealth on the planet, but we have increasing difficulty understanding ownership and relationships like that. I guess it gives us some comfort that an American citizen might be owning all this IP, but sometimes citizens move. Sometimes they make private sale decisions that could endanger national security. So this is something that we need to figure out better. And in terms of payback to the taxpayers, if we could get 1 or 2 pharmaceutical companies to pay back all the benefits of their blockbuster drugs from basic research done at NIH, it would return many more than a few $1 billion. So perhaps we need to work with our colleagues on other committees on that. On the question of paperwork, Mr. Bruno mentioned FAR 15, I think you called it. And that's a requirement that you have to endure that some others might not. But I'm not sure, is all of FAR 15 really good paperwork? Is that necessary paperwork? Can we streamline FAR 15 so that we can reduce the burden for anybody who might have to be subjected to all that paperwork burden? It's not the 10 Commandments. It's not written in stone.
The federal acquisition regulations actually provide for different models. 15 is one set, there's another set referred to as 12, and there are others that do exactly that and provide guidance when it's appropriate to use the less elaborate systems.
So there is some flexibility within that. Is FAR 15 the biggest and scariest monster out there?
Yes.
But there are lesser monsters, okay. So you just mentioned that to scare us.
Well, it happens to be
Ghost
the world
stories.
that we live in at ULA.
On the question Mr. Bridenstine mentioned, monopoly, nobody likes monopoly, but I think in a best case situation, we'd have a duopoly or maybe an oligopoly. We need to find another billionaire to back Ms. Van Kleeck here. So where's Richard Branson when we need him? Or maybe there are others with sufficient egos, because when you correctly said the business case isn't very exciting about this, diminishing number of payloads, substantial risk, it takes an investor's ego to kind of propel this sort of speculative investment, the glory of spacefaring. But so I think as we fear a monopoly, we should bear in mind that even in the best case, we're going to have an oligopoly, and that's not a whole lot better. We love the retail model where we can get Amazon pricing for everything, but that's not likely to be available here, despite Mr. Bezos's involvement. So we don't want to be too idealistic in this pursuit. And finally, there's this touchy issue of recruiting brilliant personnel. And we in America relied heavily on Werner von Braun and lots of other folks who were imported from Germany. I think the last one just died in the last year or so down in Huntsville, Alabama. So unquestionably, there are some brilliant scientists who make a difference. I couldn't help but note on the first page of Mr. Meyerson's testimony, he's recruited lots of folks from lots of places, including someone with Merlin experience. Well, that's interesting. It makes me think, regarding the RD-180, that our failure is not to have recruited a Russian who actually knew how that worked. Where is that person? And maybe the Chinese did that when they have integrated that into their Long March, or maybe they just stole the blueprints. Or, but you kind of wonder, you know, you hope that a team of scientists can do great things, and in many cases they have. But in some cases, at least, there are these brilliant individuals who come up with the secret sauce. And that leads us to the very interesting feature of SpaceX, where they do not rely on the patent system to protect their IP, preferring instead the trade secret system, which is basically thumbing their nose at the entire Western system of protecting intellectual property. And I'm not defending the inefficiencies of the patent office, or, you know, but this is kind of an interesting challenge here. You just keep it locked up in a safe, like maybe what the Coca-Cola formula, as opposed to publishing and disseminating and then protecting legally. So there are many challenges we face as we get into this issue to make sure that we have assured access to space, that we have a perhaps unique national security capability to lift whatever is required on the timetable that we need to serve the warfighter. And yet we're increasingly relying on commercial models, global models, international models that may or may not service this unique national capability. So these are some of the challenges the subcommittee faces as we try to come up with some sort of fair solution that, above all, puts America first. So that's how I see it. And if y'all publicly or privately have corrections, amendments to that, modifications, I would appreciate hearing from us, because we're trying to do the right thing and not have Congress mess up yet again like we did last year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I would note, when Congress messed up last year, it was with language the private sector gave us to put into that bill. It wasn't, we didn't dream up that language. Let's go to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, for any additional questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bruno, you mentioned earlier, to close the business case, ULA will need to be able to compete in the commercial sector for space launch. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Meyerson, does Blue Origin intend to also compete in the commercial space launch industry with its own system?
In the very long term, yes, we do. But our first iteration we're working on is our suborbital New Shepard vehicle, which we flew last month, and our focus on our rocket engines as a merchant supplier to ULA and other companies, and making those engines available.
So if and just for you, Mr. Bruno, if Blue Origin enters a space and they're competing directly against you in the commercial market and you're entirely dependent on them for your rocket engine, does that pose a risk to the cost of government launches?
In the foreseeable future, I see our activities in the marketplace as complementary. And what my colleague Rob is referring to is in the far future, when we'll have ample opportunity to work out arrangements.
If the AR-1 engine ultimately is not what is down selected, what is the future for the AR-1, Ms. Van Kleeck?
Currently, the AR-1 is relevant to this particular change in launch vehicles on this particular point in time. We don't re-engine launch vehicles, you know, but every 10 years, or we have different opportunities to do that. We would maintain the technology. We would probably put it at a technology level. But if there isn't a launch vehicle provider that will use it, the development will not be completed at this point in time.
Is there a chance that that launch vehicle provider might materialize and the AR-1 would find itself relevant in both commercial and the EELV program?
It's possible. It clearly depends on what some of the launch vehicle providers, what their paths going forward are. But as you know, there are multiple providers here on this panel, and we've talked about a limited market. So in the near term, it's not a high probability.
One of the challenges we have is certainly it seems like there are two different directions that the panel is trying to accommodate. One direction is the Air Force's position, which is we need to purchase launch as a service. And of course, that's been the going mindset for everyone for quite a while. Then we ended up in this position where the Russians got aggressive. And boy, I'll tell you, I share Chairman Rogers' position. We don't want to send one more dollar to Russia that we don't absolutely have to send to them. And certainly I agree with Chairman Rogers that we need to do everything possible to mitigate the risk to our own assured access to space. That's kind of what drove us to this position today, where we've got language in the NDAA that ultimately might not be compatible with language that says we need to purchase launch as a service. So this is a challenge that we're going to continue to have. Unfortunately, the panelists today find themselves in a challenge, where they're trying to basically go two different directions at the same time, given what's happened in the world, and of course we as Congress need to figure out a way to make this the best for our country, the best for the taxpayers, the best in the national security interests of the United States. And I know Chairman Rogers has that in his heart. The goal here is to get off any Russian engines and to make sure we have assured access to space. And we've got to make that happen. And I just appreciate you guys being here and working through this with us as we try to make it happen for our country. Thank you guys very much.
Thank the gentleman, and I concur with that completely. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman, for additional questions he may have.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I have one question. Mr. Meyerson, Blue Origin, and Mr. Thornburg from SpaceX. Has a large methane rocket engine ever been built and flown in space? Why is this? And what are the advantages and the challenges of building this type of engine?
By large, I'll say no. Engines that are greater than 250,000 pounds in thrust, there's been no large methane engine that's been built and flown to space that I know of. We've been busily working on the BE-4, and we've made some specific design choices to mitigate any risk with that development. Design choices in our chamber pressure, design choices in our injector, and design choices in our materials that'll give us confidence that we can develop this engine by the end of next year, get into testing, and meet the Vulcan launch vehicle requirements.
Mr. Thornburg.
To your first question about have we flown a large methane rocket engine, no, we have not done that. But the one thing I did want to point out is that the one aspect of, if you hear a lot about this novel technology in some of the new engine power plants that are being discussed today, I wanted to point out to the committee that the one common thread across, whether it's Raptor, whether it's AR1, or whether it's BE-4, is really the ox-rich stage combustion technology. All three engines that the three companies are working on incorporate that, and that really does represent the technology coming to the table. So whether you're trying to replace something with Atlas in terms of an AR1, you still have to finish the development of ox-rich stage combustion technology, and it's the same for BE-4. It would be the same for a Raptor engine. And I wanted to also comment that the talented engineers in the United States have been working on these types of technologies since the late 90s. Through programmatic investments of the Air Force Research Laboratory and NASA, these technologies have been available, but have yet to be fully funded and brought to the table until these conversations are happening now. So that's kind of where we stand on the methane engine development.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
Yes, sir, I would. I agree that the common thread through these things is the ox-rich stage technology. However, I would say there has been, we've worked on methane as a company. Aerojet Rocketdyne has worked on methane since the 60s, and we've built a number of different devices, none of which have flown yet. Methane is probably going to be an important technology for Mars missions when you're dealing with landers and things like that, where you want to make your propellant in space. In terms of the difference, though, between a methane and a kerosene engine for a booster, the ox-rich side's the same, but the fuels, kerosene's characterized. The ability to run kerosene in an ox-rich environment is also characterized. It's the Russians have perfected this technology over decades, I'm confident we can also do that with methane, but it's going to take time. It took the Russians a long time to get where they are. I think we understand what they've done. We will be building off of that technology. We have studied that technology for 20 years. I believe this can also be done for methane, but I think the time frame is going to be quite a bit longer.
Anyone else comment? Yes.
Not about methane, sir, but I would like to point out that there are other technologies involved here that involve propulsion systems, and they've been mentioned several times, and that's the solid rocket motors that contribute to our access to space, whether they're strap-ons or main stages. That's a part of our heritage as a country, and Orbital ATK is very much involved with that and working with several people here on the panel on making sure that that's a part of their systems. Any system going forward is going to have either newly developed or perfected solid rocket motors as a part of it, whether it's the main engine or additional propulsion or second stages. And I think that needs to be a part of the discussion too, is how to maintain the lead that we have in this country in solid rocket motors and solid rocket propellants over the rest of the world to help with national defense, as well as our access to space for these big payloads.
Yes, Ms. Thornburg.
Just to comment back on the methane side, I think the research and development and the testing that's been performed by SpaceX's private investment, as well as activities that have been happening with Blue Origin, are proving out the viability of methane as a fuel, whether it's ox-rich or a full-flow stage combustion cycle. I'd also like to say that we've been operating hydrogen propulsion systems in this country since the dawn of the space age. Hydrogen obviously offers a lot more complexities in the design, et cetera. Methane typically falls somewhere between hydrogen and kerosene in terms of handling due to the nature of its cryogenic properties. So, but I did want to point out that there's been a lot of research and development in methane ongoing in the private sector, independent of government investment over the last several years.
Could I just add one comment to that?
Sure.
We talk about methane, but the choice of fuel for the BE-4 is liquefied natural gas, which is commercially available methane. It's the commodity that you can buy, and the infrastructure in the U.S. is growing rapidly in the last decade. So we've chosen LNG because it's cheap. It's 4 times cheaper than kerosene, RP1, the rocket propellant grade. It's available, and it's clean, so it supports reusability applications, which we are interested in the long term. And those are very important points that we want to add.
Then, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thornburg, I'd like to drill down just a little bit more on a line of questions I was pursuing earlier to hopefully get a little more clarity. In response to a question for the record from the last hearing, General Hyten stated that, quote, SpaceX has not formally submitted the changes desired to be accepted under certification for the full thrust system to the Air Force, unquote. If SpaceX hasn't formally submitted the changes, then how is it that your system should be certified for launch or eligible for competition on EELV?
Sir, I'd have to get back to you on the specifics of what's been transferred, but I can tell you that, to my knowledge presently, since the last hearing, there has been numerous conversations between the Air Force and SpaceX specifically to address this information. I believe the bulk of all that has been provided and is being discussed between the Air Force and SpaceX. But I'm happy to take that and provide it back for the record.
Well, that doesn't really satisfy me. Let me approach this from a little different angle. And I'm going to refer to an article from a March 17th of this year Aviation Week article entitled, SpaceX Sees U.S. Air Force Certification of Falcon 9 by Midsummer. Okay, and here's a quote out of that article. This year, SpaceX, and it's a lengthy quote, so bear with me for a minute. This year, SpaceX expects to debut another Falcon 9 upgrade, one that will see at least a 15% increase in thrust for the Falcon 9's 9 Merlin 1D core stage engines, and a 10% increase in the upper stage tank volume. NASA has said such an increase in thrust is likely to require significant design modifications to the engine and rocket, which could necessitate additional certification work, including a series of successful flights to prove the vehicle. So how is it that NASA can say that these are significant modifications and that they require additional certification and possibly test flights, and yet you don't seem to think that there is a need for more certification?
The language you use, no need for more certification, just to clarify, I guess my comments earlier were mainly with regards to resetting the clock on certification. There's been ongoing certification work to upgrades of launch vehicles long before SpaceX was in existence. So my comments there were mainly focused on the fact that SpaceX is not doing anything different than ULA has done over the years with Atlas and Delta in terms of bringing on new improvements to systems that improve performance and cost. I can also say that we're working very closely with NASA and the Air Force, who have both certified us for their launches, for their payloads this year, and we have ongoing conversations with them with regards to the status of the vehicle. They're fully read into all of the changes, all of the modifications that are planned and are going, and are fully supportive of what we're doing in terms of gaining the certification for upcoming launches.
Okay, well, let me change gears and ask my last question. You stated in your opening statement that there should be a 50-50 investment in a new engine. Did SpaceX follow that guideline for Falcon 9 investment?
With Falcon 9 investment, SpaceX 100% invested in the development of that launch vehicle, so yes.
Now, it is you said 100%. It is my understanding that the bulk of SpaceX's capital is actually a forward-funded NASA contract or contracts totaling around $3.5 billion. Is that correct?
I can't speak to the total, but if you're referring to the COTS program itself, the NASA money under the COTS program to supply the space station was focused on the Dragon space capsule versus the Falcon 9 launch vehicle, which SpaceX funded the development of.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Really, I appreciate all of y'all. Ms. Thornburg, you made a great point when you emphasized we got ourselves into this situation, and the ranking member did, when the U.S. stopped investing heavily enough in this technology and developing where we need to be and where we should have been before now. But our full attention is focused on the matter now, and we appreciate you being here. I would remind all the witnesses we're going to keep the record open for at least 10 days in case any members have any additional questions they'd like to ask you to respond to for the record, and I'd appreciate a timely response to those. We are about to have another panel of government witnesses. I very much hope you will listen to them and let us know what you think about what they say, because it'll continue to help us as we continue to grow and develop and trying to move this policy in the right direction. And with that, we are stand recessed for this panel to adjourn and then bring the new panel in. But he was on overdrive, and that I heard that when he was reading. Well, I was wide awake reading. Yeah, he's not shy.
Run out of juice there? You're running out of juice.
Yeah. That's somebody with a lot of time. I was surprised about that one. I was very surprised about King Beaver, just as a lawyer. But no, I really expected the ruling that came out today. Oh, hey.
We didn't get a chance to meet yesterday,
Yes,
but
sir.
we have met before.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Hope it was helpful. A few more comments. I'm sorry we ran out of time.
Yeah, well, I would love for y'all to get in. I'd now like to welcome the experts for our second panel. I want to thank you all for coming here today and preparing for it. We have the Honorable Katrina McFarland, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, General John Hyten, Commander, Air Force Space Command, and General McFarland, that would have been good. General Hyten and Ms. McFarland, it's great to have you back to testify on this topic. We truly appreciate your opinions, and we also look forward to hearing from Lieutenant General Sam Greaves, Commander, Air Force Space and Missile Command Center. And we also have Dr. Mike who is representing himself today, but he was Deputy Chair of SecDef's RD-180 Availability Risk Mitigation Study, and he is also a former NASA administrator. Ms. McFarland, now that you're General McFarland, I'll turn it over to you to start with. You're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement. I would tell all the witnesses your opening statements in full will be submitted for the record. If you'd just like to summarize them with your time, we'll get right to questions. Ms. McFarland.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and appear before this committee, particularly since you're supposed to be at recess, and I ask that my written testimony, as you state, be taken for the record. Thank you. Assured access to space continues to be critical to our defense space capabilities and national security, especially as our world has changed over the last decade into a non-permissive environment. During our March 17th hearing on assured access to space, we touched on many topics concerning the evolved expendable launch vehicle program. Amongst those were the department's plans for reintroducing competition on how we procure our launch services for national security space, or NSS satellites, and our plan for transitioning away from the use of the RD-180 engine, the Russian engine, onto domestically sourced propulsion capabilities. And while I'm pleased to state that we're making progress on both of these, competition and transition is intrinsically and fundamentally intertwined. This interdependency can't be ignored, it must be managed. And as you heard with the members from before us, it's a complex issue. And with SpaceX Falcon 9 V1.1 launch system now certified for NSS launches, we have for the first time since ULA's joint venture formation enabled competition for NSS launch contract services. However, Section 1608 of the FY15 NDAA prohibits any use beyond the Block 1 contract with ULA for our most cost-effective launch capability, ULA Atlas V, which relies on that Russian RD-180 engine. As enacted, Section 1608 creates a multi-year gap without at least 2 price-competitive launch providers and trades ULA for SpaceX as the sole providers on median and some intermediate NSS launches. It also impacts ULA's viability to compete in the future, as discussed, as an estimate to replace and certify this capability is optimistically about 7 years. And yes, I'm a recovering engineer, and it is a complex issue, sir. To avoid this unacceptable situation, the department submitted legislative proposal number 192 requesting Section 1608 be amended. The department believes this legislative proposal, combined with the addition of the newly certified SpaceX Falcon 9 V1.1, enables the department to minimize impacts to its assured access to space-based capabilities while industry completes its transition using domestically designed and produced propulsion systems. The department greatly appreciates this subcommittee's support of the legislative proposal and looks forward to working with Congress and the Defense Committees as the FY16 budget authorizations and appropriation languages are debated. The Air Force released a request for information, RFI, you heard some of it earlier, to industry around August 2014, soliciting feedback on approaches for transitioning away from the RD-180. Responses supported the department's strategy to co-invest with industry to transition off the RD-180 and provide launch capabilities able to support NSS requirements, but in markedly broader approaches than anticipated, as you heard. As a result of the RFI, and in order to comply with the commercial space trade transportation services and assured access to space mandates, the Air Force developed a 4-step incremental strategy to fully transition onto domestic propulsion capabilities as being discussed. The department remains committed to working with Congress and industry to transition off this RD-180 engine in the most efficient, expeditious, and affordable manner possible, while ensuring continued compliance with the Assured Access to Space and Commercial Trade Space Transportation Service laws. Again, thank you for your support to our critical missions, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ms. McFarland. General Hyten, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cooper, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to appear before you again to talk about this important issue with my distinguished colleagues. Thank you all for your continued efforts to work this hard topic, because as Ms. McFarland said, it's a very difficult topic to try to work through. So I believe everybody's been fortunate enough to witness our nation's evolution in space power, while our combatant and theater commanders have fully realized how fundamental space-based effects are to every military operation that takes place on the globe today. However, these capabilities are merely an illusion without assured access to space. With today's national reliance on space capabilities, assured access has gone from important to imperative and remains one of our highest priorities. The launch industry has fundamentally changed over the last few decades. The Air Force no longer owns the vehicles we launch. We purchase access to space as a service. And industry is now investing large amounts of private capital in developing new engines and rockets. And we're collaborating closely with them to determine how best to invest in public-private partnerships and U.S.-made rocket propulsion system. So within context of assured access to space, it's absolutely critical that we move as fast as we can to eliminate reliance on the Russian RD-180 rocket engine. The United States should not remain dependent on another nation to assure access to space, and we need an American hydrocarbon engine. It'll be a significant challenge, but we think with the efforts and ingenuity of our government and industry teams, it is possible to develop an American engine by 2019. However, the engine still has to be made into a rocket. It still has to be made into a complete space launch system. And even if that system looks similar to the Atlas V, we still need to integrate that new engine, test it, certify it, and that's going to take another year or two once the engine is developed. We do not want to be in a position where significant resources have been expended on a rocket engine and no commercial provider has built or modified the necessary rocket. This subcommittee can be assured of our commitment toward competition and a healthy space launch industrial base as we move as fast as we can towards U.S.-built rocket engines. Thank you for your support. I look forward to continuing partnership, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Hyten. General Greaves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Space capabilities are essential to the American way of life, and they multiply the effectiveness of our warfighters. Thanks to the efforts of the men and women of the Space and Missile Systems Center, our many contractors, and many mission partners, we continue to deliver worldwide precision navigation, threat warning, protected strategic and tactical communications, and many other capabilities from space. As we have all come to know, space launch is a key to providing all of that capability. We address the critical nature of space launch through a policy of assured access to space, maintaining at least 2 reliable launch systems as a credible method for continued access to space, should one suffer a grounding event. As part of this approach, we purchase launch services on a commercial basis, leveraging America's most important source of innovation and national economic strength, our free market. These two concepts, assured access to space and competition, are the cornerstones of our national launch policy. They guide our implementation as we execute the 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, which outlines the use of the RD-180 and mandates that we develop a next-generation rocket propulsion system. In response, I will emphasize that the Air Force is 100% committed to transitioning off of the RD-180 for national security space launch as quickly and as prudently as possible to a domestically produced liquid or solids-based rocket propulsion system. From our perspective, solely replacing the RD-180 with a new engine is not the complete solution, since rockets are heavily influenced by engine design. Even a drop-in replacement, which closely matches the RD-180 physical interfaces and performance, would require modifications to the launch vehicle structures, the fuel and oxidizer feed lines, and the heat shields to accommodate even minor differences in performance. As was mentioned by the previous panel, the thrust vector control and throttling of the RD-180 engine is a critical characteristic of the Atlas V. The new engine's thrust vectoring and throttling will require changes to the electronic control systems and significant engineering analysis to develop new flight profiles to launch the various satellites. So, in other words, A rocket engine specifically engineered to replace the RD-180 on the Atlas would most likely be usable only for the ULA's Atlas and not by any other launch service provider without significant modifications to the engine and/or the launch vehicle. We also do not believe this would meet the intent of open competition. Additionally, as a product of our market research, we found that if we procured an engine not designed for a specific launch vehicle, commercial providers would be unlikely to build a rocket around it without the government also funding the redesign of their launch vehicles, adding time, cost, and risk we cannot afford. So the Air Force is pursuing a strategy of shared investment with industry using public-private partnerships at the launch service level. The goal of this plan is to produce at least 2 domestic, commercially viable launch systems, including the accompanying liquid fuel engines or solid rocket motors. In our research, we assessed that industry timelines predicting complete rocket propulsion systems by 2019 are aggressive. History has consistently shown that developing, testing, and maturing an engine takes 6 to 7 years, with another year or 2 beyond that to be able to integrate into the launch vehicle. Now, with all that said, we are moving fast, very fast on this. To execute this plan, we have developed an aggressive 4-step acquisition strategy to reach this end state as quickly as possible. Step 1 pursues technical maturation and risk reduction efforts, building our expertise within the U.S. Step 2 targets shared investments in rocket propulsion system development. Step 3 guides the transition of our shared investments into the provider's launch system. And finally, Step 4 directs the acquisition of launch services to meet national security space requirements. As we move forward, our overall goal is to preserve assured access to space by maintaining our laser focus on mission success. Our approach will accomplish this by supporting competition where it credibly exists and by acquiring space launch as a service from certified, commercially viable providers using domestically produced rocket propulsion systems. If we do this, we will be on a path to transitioning off of the RD-180 and having at least 2 domestically produced, commercially viable launch providers that are certified to meet national security space requirements by the end of FY22. Thank you for your support in helping us get here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Greaves. Dr. Griffin, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You need to turn your microphone. Thank you.
Right. Seems I've forgotten some things. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be asked to appear before your subcommittee to testify on the matter before us today. However, before beginning any substantive discussion, I think I should note for the record that I'm here as an independent witness and a private individual. I've received no consideration of any kind in connection with the topic of today's hearing from anyone. I'm here on personal leave and at personal expense and do not represent any company, agency, or committee on which I've served in the past or presently serve. So with that said, we're here to discuss the RD-180 and its replacement. The RD-180 has been used for 2 decades on various versions of Atlas, and without that engine or a functionally equivalent replacement, today's Atlas V launch vehicle will be grounded, and with it, 2/3 of our national security payloads as we presently have the manifest. And so while I completely agree that we should not continue to be dependent upon a foreign power, much less an adversary, for any element of our national space launch capability, I do believe that the legislative action which has been taken in this regard is a bit too abrupt. It might be that we should wean ourselves of this dependence a bit more gently. But if the Atlas is grounded, then what? Well, U.S. policy and law require 2 independent systems for national security space launch capability. This requirement is met, but only partially so with the Delta IV family. Previous panels said that payloads could be shifted from Atlas to Delta IV. That is so, but many critical payloads are not immediately interchangeable between these vehicles and would require considerable rework at considerable cost to shift from Atlas to Delta. Moreover, the Delta is in general more expensive than the equivalent Atlas, and the top-end Delta performance of Delta IV medium is less than that of the top-end Atlas. so some Atlas payloads will not be transferable to Delta. Finally, the Delta production limitations are such that without a massive increase in manufacturing and launch infrastructure, very limited surge capacity is even possible. So the net effect of shifting national security space systems from Atlas to Delta, should we have to do so, will be several years of delay for the average payload and many billions of dollars of increased cost. Now, some have said that the best forward path is to discard decades of government investment in and experience with the Atlas and develop a whole new system. This does nothing to solve today's problems. And even if it did, it's irrational to suppose that an entirely new launch vehicle can be obtained more quickly or at less cost than a new engine alone. Others would have us believe that the U.S. government can merely purchase launch services from among multiple competitors as if one were selecting a particular airline for a desired trip based on airfare and schedule. Purveyors of this launch as a service view would have us believe that if we have an engine supply problem, the U.S. government should stay on the sidelines while the market solves the problem. But in reality, the U.S. national security launch architecture is a strategic capability, having far more in common with other strategic assets such as fighters, bombers, aircraft carriers, and submarines than it does with airlines and cruise ships. The vagaries of the market cannot be allowed to determine whether or not critical payloads make it to space. Accordingly, the U.S. government must be prepared to ensure that the supply chain required to maintain this critical asset remains intact. That supply chain is currently quite fragile because while we have been supporting the Russian rocket engine industrial base, our own has withered. To conclude, we have an engine problem, not a rocket problem. I believe we should solve it by building a government-funded, government-owned American equivalent to the RD-180 as quickly as we can possibly do so. We should not allow the many obfuscating issues which have been raised in connection with this problem to cloud our view of what must be done. Thank you. My full statement, I hope, will be entered for the record.
It certainly will. Well, listen, before I get into my questions that I've prepared, you heard the previous panel. Is anybody just chomping at the bit to take on something that came out in that previous panel that you think the committee needs to hear for sure? Dr. Griffin.
Sir, I might, I need to comment on one of the last statements of the SpaceX representative that the development of Falcon 9 was done on private funds and that NASA money spent went on Dragon. I personally am the originator of the COTS program, and that program was intended to provide seed money, and I emphasize seed money, not majority funding, for the development of a new launch vehicle and a delivery system for cargo to space station. After I left the agency with the inauguration of President Obama, considerably more money was supplied to SpaceX. I think from public sources it's easily possible to show that SpaceX has received about $3.5 billion or so, possibly more, in open source funding. Seeing as how they've conducted 7 launches for NASA, counting the one upcoming this week, that's either an extraordinarily high price per launch of about $500 million per launch, which I don't believe is the case, or a considerable amount of that money has gone into capitalizing the company. The money was not segregated out according to Dragon or Falcon 9, so I very strongly believe that the government money which has been provided to SpaceX has in fact gone for the development of Falcon 9.
Anybody else? Anything that just jumps out at you? You know, y'all heard me hope optimistically that more than 2 companies are going to be competing for this engine. I hope that we wind up with 3 or 4 or more getting into this competition when it really gets going. All right. In last year's 2014 space hearing, I asked the witnesses if they think that developing a competitively acquired next generation engine available to all U.S. providers that could effectively replace the RD-180 was important. General Shelton, the predecessor of General Hyten, stated, quote, "I would be a strong supporter of that if we can find the money to do it," close quote. Mr. Gil Klinger, who used to work for Ms. McFarland, stated, quote, "I think in the long run, it is in the interest of the United States government to develop a next-generation rocket, U.S.-produced rocket engine," close quote. We took their advice and directed the department to build a domestic propulsion system that ends our reliance on the engines by 2019, and we provided $220 million just to get started. But now when I read your plan, it's not clear to me that we are focused on developing a domestic engine. What's changed since that testimony? And I'd like to ask all the witnesses, in your professional judgment, if we have two options, one, to replace an engine with a proven technology, or two, to build a new engine with an unproven technology, new launch vehicle, and new infrastructure, what is the lower risk, most expedient, and the least cost to the taxpayers? Anybody wants to take it on? General Hyten.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll make two comments, and then I'll turn it over to my fellow members on the panel. So the first comment is that the United States leads the world in two elements of the rocket engine business. We lead the world in solids, and we lead the world in liquid oxygen hydrogen engines. I think we should lead the world in every category of engine development. The one we don't lead in is hydrocarbon development. I believe the United States, no matter what the rest of this discussion goes on, the United States should develop a technology program that builds hydrocarbon technology for the United States across the board. I think it's essential to what we do as a country. We've avoided that for about 20 years, and we ought to take that on and go forward to that, however this turns out. The second issue is what's changed. What's changed since the last time we talked is we actually have a bill. We have a National Defense Authorization Act that gave us very specific guidance, and the guidance said that we need to pursue engines that grow to a domestic alternative for national security space launches. It tells us they have to be made in the United States. I think all the previous panel did that. They said they have to meet the requirements of the national security space community. I think they did that. Developed not later in 2019. That's a challenge, but we heard that. And then be developed using full and open competition. That full and open competition is exactly the structure we put in place. We were specifically told by the law not to go to a specific vendor, not to go build a specific engine, but to go look at full and open competition across industry. And we look at the previous panel, the thing that struck me about the previous panel that was very impressive is how much they had embraced that across the board, from Blue Origin to ULA to Aerojet Rocketdyne to Orbital ATK to SpaceX, to embrace that, to look at that place. So the competition was very important. But when you do full and open competition, you have to go through the process to make sure it is full and open and fair across industry. That does not happen overnight. So I just make those two comments for the record, sir.
General Greaves.
Mr. Chairman, you asked whether or not we should replace the RD-180 with proven technology. As the previous panel did express, we do not have the capability within the United States today to replace that engine. So whatever we come up with will be a new engine. In the Air 1, the BE-4, they were both mentioned. Now, from our point of view, replacing an engine has effects on the overall capability that we plan to deliver. So we must verify the impacts of any changes to any component in the system, especially the engine, on the rocket itself and our ability to deliver that capability to orbit. So combined with what General Hyten just mentioned, our approach is to look at the total capability, the total system that will result from any changes to any component, to include the engine. And that's why we start from the launch service, ultimate capability, assess what the impacts are, and then decide whether or not, as you'll see through the four-step process that we have in place, whether or not any of the providers, and by the way, we did have what we're referencing as a broad response from industry to the RPS proposal that we put out there that arrived a couple of days ago that we're assessing right now. So there is interest, but we must look at the impacts from any changes to the rocket, to the system, on that system. Thank you.
Ms. McFarland.
Chairman, I think it was very clear that one thing came out from each of the previous industry comments. There isn't a drop-in replacement for an RD-180 on the table. Form, fit, and function, maybe. but not a drop-in exact replacement. So really what we're focused on is risks. How do we leverage our funds and risks? Is it going to be leveraging funds from the government and the risk is to the government and we pass that risk back to industry? Or do we take and work together with industry and funding and share the risks? I call it the pay me now or pay me later. Each of these industry have already stated there is a limited industrial base for commercialization immediately. I shared with you earlier the Satellite Industry Association study that says there's a modest growth. It's somewhere between 4 and 9%. They, in commercial world, don't use the size, as you're familiar with, that we have for payloads. So we carry, no matter what, an underwriting of whatever comes out of here. And because we don't have the IP to the RD-180, and we haven't developed, as been stated repeatedly here, the engineering expertise that understands the metallurgy and necessarily the methodology to do the propulsions in exact form, we have to assess that we're going to have some modicum of risk. The Air Force proposal as it stands and with their RFP are pursuing getting the government and industry smart together to the point where they can make a logical decision to the next step. Can we purvey going forward with a launch system? Shall we look at just propulsion system? Shall we look at just engine? And what's the most cost-effective, and by the way, timely, we're racing against time, proposal? The advancements from industry is reassuring. The question is now, where do we place that risk and how can we afford it? Particularly, as I mentioned to you also earlier and with the ranking member, we're concerned with sequestration right in the midst of trying to rush to moving forward on this replacement. It hits us right at our weakest joint, FY16.
You heard the witnesses in the previous panel talk about the degree of modifications that would be required to take one of the new proposed rocket engines and put it on the rocket itself. And they didn't disagree with numbers that I've heard from you earlier, General Hyten, of $200 million for not just the rocket, but all the infrastructure changes, and that was the floor. Do you still believe that is at a minimum what we're going to be looking at, no matter which alternative we select?
Mr. Chairman, I won't disagree with what Mr. Bruno said, what his numbers are. The numbers I shared with you are the numbers I heard from Mr. Bruno. We'll know more as we actually get into the contract activities with them. General Greaves will be going down that path with him directly. But I think those are ballpark numbers that they're fair to look at. But they're not tens of millions of dollars. I think $200 million is the floor.
Is the floor. Now, the one big change from our last assured access hearing to this hearing, it's been striking to me, is the idea of hitting 2019 for completion of testing and providing your system for Air Force certification seemed ambitious, but realistic. Now, and you heard from the previous panel, with high degrees of confidence, they believe they're going to have not only completed testing of their systems, but have completed certification easily by 2019. General Greaves, you seem to have some real concerns about that. Do you think that's just optimism or silly?
Sir, I believe they're discussing certification of the engine. When we talk certification, we're talking certification of the system. So the engine plus everything, any modification to the engine brings with it, software, structures, loads, flight dynamics, processing, manufacturing. That's what we refer to as certification. So I do believe it is aggressive, but then that's only part of the answer.
So you just created a new question for the record for all of our industry panelists, is we're going to find out if they were talking about what certification process.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, John.
I was listening real close, and the BE-4 answer from Blue Origin, the quote was ready to integrate and fly in 2019, and the Aerojet Rocketdyne was certification of the engine in 2019. So I think that's a great question for the record, but I was listening very close to that as well to hear what they said about certification.
May I add a comment?
Dr.
Mr.
Griffin,
Chairman?
yes, love to hear your thoughts on this.
I first want to say that I very strongly agree with General Hyten that large hydrocarbon engine technology is one which we let go at our peril, our national peril. I would point out we've never actually agreed not to have it. We just did a make or buy decision back in 1995, and we decided to buy it. That option doesn't look so smart right now, and so I think we need to relearn how to make it. I'm not interested in replicating RD-180 technology. I'm interested in going beyond it, and that's what I believe we will and should do. Secondly, I believe that there is considerable self-interest on the part of a number of different parties in estimating the difficulty of integrating a new engine on a launch vehicle. I don't think it's a $10 million problem, but I'm not sure that I agree that it's a multi-$100 million problem. I actually compiled an incomplete list of 14 different engines which have been used on a plethora of different launch vehicles and stages, and 8 different rocket engine stages which have been re-engined over the course of 50-some years of American space history. I would be happy to submit that for the record, but I simply, the history of this matter does not show it to be so horribly difficult to re-engine a vehicle as some of our earlier witnesses were saying. I just...
And if you would submit that for the record, I'd
I will submit that for the record. I just simply don't believe it to be so difficult.
Before I go to the ranking member, General Hyten, I want to go back to the specific language you wrote down that Blue Origin and Aerojet offered. When Blue Origin said they would be ready to fly by 2019, how did you interpret that? Did that mean they had completed the certification process?
For their engine. I interpret that as the engine would be ready for us to start into a certification flight test program in 2019. The certification flight test program takes a year or two, usually about 2 years to go through from a very first flight of an engine. So that was interesting to me because...
And what does the Aerojet language mean to you?
What the Aerojet language means to me was a similar thing, except they said by the end of 2019 the engine would be ready, and they didn't say ready to fly on a rocket. They said it would be ready by the end of 2019.
Which you interpret as meaning having completed the certification process?
The engine, not
the engine,
not the system.
Okay. So in either case, you're talking about just the engine, not the system.
And that's what I heard from both of them. I heard the engine would be ready in 2019 at best. But I think it's important to point out that both of those technologies have significant challenges that they're going to have to work through. Now, I believe that industry on both sides, especially in the competitive environment, can aggressively pursue those and get through those. But methane, as I think a number of the members of the committee talked about, is a new endeavor when you get above 250,000 pounds of thrust. And this LOX stage combustion across the board has not been done yet. So there are still technical risks to pursue in either activity that we need to remember.
Great, thank you. Ranking members recognized for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a budget hawk, and I hate to bring up the issue of sequestration, but that probably is, as Ms. McFarland pointed out, the most important issue we face, not only for this issue, but for all the military issues. And this committee has ducked it yet again. So to put a fine point on it, under this NDAA, we will be borrowing $30 billion. We say from the OCO account, but it's non-budgeted, increase the deficit. We'll probably be borrowing it from China. And yet none of us has thought of or proposed, oh, we'd buy the Long March missile from China to meet our gap. But we're taking the money from them, but we wouldn't consider buying their missile based on RD-180 technology. So I hope the members of this committee and of this Congress will solve the sequestration problem, something that repeated Congresses have failed to do, which dramatically injures our national defense capability. So that's the big issue. So within that giant issue, we're focusing on this. I need to ask the witnesses and the chairman this question. General Greaves indicated there's been broad interest in the latest RFP. Great. But that's for more than re-engining. So I'm interested to find out get clarity in this hearing, whether the chairman would be interested in a new RFP just for a new engine. Are we buying missile systems, or are we buying new engines? General Greaves.
Congressman Cooper, the broad response from industry includes initial proposals from both engine providers as well as launch service providers. So we are assessing that combination as we speak. We received it 3 days ago. We're on a timeline to select the best and get detailed proposals from the remainder.
But any new RFP would delay the whole process.
Yes, sir.
Terribly.
But we believe that...
And you've already expressed, or at least General Hyten has, extreme skepticism about the possibility of getting a certified engine replacement by 2019. Right?
Yes, sir. We believe a new RFP would delay the process, but we also believe that the current process we have, the RPS way ahead, encompasses both opportunities for inputs from engine providers and launch service providers themselves. So within that sum total of inputs we have today, we believe it's highly likely we'll find a way through this.
And I'd respond to the ranking member's question with last year's NDA specific language on this. The agreement includes the House provision with an amendment that would direct the Secretary of Defense to develop a rocket propulsion system that is made in the United States, is developed no later than 2019 using full and open competition, meets the requirements of the national security space community, and is available for purchase by all space launch providers of the United States. We note that this provision is, quote, not an authorization for funds for development of a new launch vehicle, period. And I'll submit that for the record.
Well, but this Congress, this committee can say 2019. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. And we've heard from our Air Force experts extreme skepticism that that could happen.
You may have heard skepticism, but I hope you also heard optimism. Because when you get in a competitive environment and you actually engage the best scientists and engineers that we have, I think it's possible to get there in 2019. The skepticism that I think you're referring to is talking about the significant technical challenges in a couple of areas. And then we also have the thrust vector control issue that was talked about by the previous committee too that we have to work through. We're not going to go down that technology path. I think in the long term that would be a good technology program for the United States to go down as well.
Well, we keep on using this word competition. At least from the previous panel, there are really only two competitors if you get down to it. You know, there's the ULA group and then there's SpaceX. And Orbital wants to get in maybe sometime, but this isn't a retail environment. There are not lots of folks vying for this lumpy business. Now, there are more folks interested in commercial, but that's not what we're talking about here. You know, this basically, at least due to market interest, is not an interesting business space unless you're a multi-billionaire with a big ego. You know, and by the way, the missing billionaire for the hydrocarbon engine, maybe we could find a Texas oil man who's interested in funding a hydrocarbon research platform, because Dr. Griffin's probably right. We need world-class research in this area. Well, where has it been for decades? You know, we haven't had the backing for it somehow. So we're in this fix right now.
We were buying it from Russia because it was, in Ms. McFarland's earlier words, pay me now or pay me later, and we chose to take the route of buying a relatively inexpensive recurring engine rather than preserving our own industrial base. At this point, that does not look like it was the smart alternative then, and I would suggest that we do not repeat it.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Dr. Griffin, but there's some advantages sometimes to big government, and you proposed a government-funded, government-owned solution. Many of my colleagues across the aisle call that big government, and they resist that. They want to turn over virtually everything to the private sector.
Well, sir, I'm a free market conservative, and if I thought that the market were such as to supply this item as it does for airline transportation or computers, then I would want the government to buy it off the market. My observation is that, well, I'll just put it like this. Last year, ULA conducted one commercial launch and something like a dozen national security or other government launches. That's the ratio here of free market to national requirements. So I suggest, I'm urging the committee to consider regarding this item as a national security item first, with some possibility of dual use. But for the national security side, if we believe it to be so, then we must ensure our supply chain. And that's everything from thrust vector control systems and guidance systems to ground infrastructure to airframes to engines. We must ensure that cradle to grave, we in the national security community have taken care that we can get every item we need.
I like your argument because we do need assured access to space. I think you went a little bit too far if you used the ULA ratio last year as the appropriate mix. It could be that the ULA is the higher cost provider for commercial, and that's why so much of the business has been taken by SpaceX. But regardless of that, there are certain needs that only the government can perform, and we should step up and do that and fully pay for those, unlike we're doing with our overall defense budget, because we're still relying on sequestration and borrowing the money essentially from the Chinese. So we've got to get real about this, and this committee has failed in that regard. I'm a little worried about the aspect of the Air Force demanding, competition and performance and everything like that, and then you're the gatekeeper. So you could slow walk or prevent, otherwise qualified vendor from achieving success. This assumed horizon of 6 to 7 years is worrisome because we won World War II in that time frame, but now everything's slower in the modern age. So I'm a little bit worried, and we saw this a little bit with the last SpaceX certification. It was 6 months at least longer than expected, and I want to make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, but sometimes we're not quite sure where it's lost in the bureaucracy. So, General Greaves.
Congressman Cooper, just let me restate that we are 100% focused on expediting our transition off the RD-180, and as well as ensuring that we have a level playing field between all applicants for that work effort. And we have not, to date, excluded any of the proposed options to include solids. We have the 4-step process, which will drive us to a conclusion expeditiously. And we do have the opportunity, if we find that for one or more reasons that one or more of the proposals that we're reviewing now will not close from a business case perspective, won't meet requirements, someone can't meet what we need, to essentially go back to step 1, which is the technical maturation activity to pursue an engine development if needed.
But see, that sounds like such a great answer. And you said expeditiously, and that sounds great. But the definition of expeditiously in the modern age is 6 to 7 years.
So, sir, I'm talking for step 2, which is the RFP that we're currently assessing. Awards between September and December of this year. It's a 2-step process. Does the set of initial proposals that we have now even meet or not meet the requirement, narrowing it down and moving on? Because you heard from the previous panel, sir, these providers have been working on this issue for quite some time on their own, and we do not believe it will take an exorbitant amount of time to get to a decision.
Well, we all hope it won't be an exorbitant amount of time, but, we heard the FAR 15 problems, and no one has ever proposed to us reforming FAR 15. Ms. McFarland.
If I could, I think that was one of the things that's underlying your question. What the Air Force used was an other than transaction. They aren't using 12 or 15. That's similar to what you see in DARPA, I'm sure. That's a very important tool that they're using to expedite not only the speed, but the innovation. It's not as prescriptive as we discussed in that earlier one.
So it's not as scary as FAR 15, the big monster, but this is a little monster.
This is like boo-boo.
Well, I'm sure they'll be comforted by that. There's an essential question of fact here. SpaceX testifies that they can handle 60% of national security loads. 60%. Okay, Ms. McFarland in her testimony said that they can do 4 of 8, which sounds like 50%. And then Dr. Griffin, in his testimony, said 2/3 of the payloads would be grounded. You know, so what is it?
Well, I'll answer first. I was privileged to be asked to serve on the Mitchell Committee last year as deputy chair to look at RD-180 alternatives, and we surveyed the manifest at that time, and 2/3 of the individual flights in the manifest were on Atlas V, one version of it or another. That's just a fact. When SpaceX talks about can lift 60% of the payloads, I'm not arguing that that's not the case, but many of those payloads will be repeat versions of the same thing. It doesn't mean that they can lift 60% of all possible spacecraft that the national security community has to be launched.
Mm-hmm. Do we have the legal ability here to force the continuation of the Delta medium? Because that's what SpaceX claims would eliminate any gap even today.
Mercifully, sir, I am not a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. General Graves, you're a lawyer, aren't you?
Yes, sir. I believe the entire discussion of the Delta IV revolves around the ability of the United Launch Alliance to remain competitive with something like a Falcon 9. And as Mr. Bruno mentioned before, they are asking for the time to transition between where we are today and whatever their new system, the Vulcan is. And to do that, they need a steady stream of revenue to maintain the capability to get there. So from what they've briefed us, to brief me, if the Delta IV was forced to compete with the Falcon 9, it would not be cost competitive and most likely would not win. So without that, and Mr. Bruno mentioned it in the previous hearing, without that assurance of that steady stream of revenue, it would be hard to receive the capital investment they need to make that transition. So it's not, in our opinion, a matter of whether or not the Delta IV can meet all requirements or we can force them to stay. I believe it's a matter of whether or not ULA can remain in business during the transition with the Delta IV as a competitive item.
So we could make it happen if we paid them to make it happen?
Yes, sir.
And, okay. Final point would be this. I'm worried overall that the short tenure of generalships does not meet these multi-year national security capabilities. Because so many of the personnel and leaders of these companies are retired Air Force. And, you know, when we have 3-year, 4-year, 2 years for duty, and I'm not impugning anyone's integrity. It just seems like when we have a 20-year or 30-year time horizon on some of these things, and we're rotating in and out personnel, success is sometimes defined as punching your ticket on your command. And if that's sufficient, you know, that, because we're on the receiving end of a 20-year problem here, and I wonder where those folks are.
So I understand the argument, Congressman, I really do, but, and it may be an anomaly, but I'll just point out that I came back into this element of the business in February of 2010. And I started coming over here to the Hill in February of 2010, working this issue as the space acquisition person under the acquisition chain for 2 years, then as the vice commander of Space Command, now as the commander of Space Command. So I've been in this area, focused on this area for over 5 years now. And this is essentially important to me personally to make sure we get this done correctly, because I don't want to leave a problem for the people that come after me, because I understand that I have a finite amount of time left in the service now, and I want to make sure that we get it right so that the folks that come after me don't have to worry about this problem.
Yeah. And you're a good man, and 5 years on a problem is a very long time for the Air Force, but that pales in comparison to Admiral Rickover's tenure with Navy Nuclear.
It does, sir. I understand the argument.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And the point that the ranking members make is one I completely agree with. It's one of my frustrations in this world that's so complex that we have these short tenures of really sharp people like you, and it'd be awful nice if we could make those instead of 3-year tenures, 6 years or thereabouts. Anyway, gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the issue of the sequester came up, I'll take an opportunity to share what I think a lot of us on this panel worked on very hard. Every year, we reauthorize the Department of Defense. Every year, we appropriate funds for the Department of Defense. We have done that again this year. And we have found a way to unwind the sequester on defense for a year and meet the President's budget request. Some people would argue that the color of money isn't right. I would argue that they are correct. I would also argue that the money spends the same way and the money is all green. And what we need to do is unwind this defense sequester permanently. But for now, we have funded the Department of Defense at the President's budget request level. That's what we have done, and we worked really hard on both sides of the aisle to make this happen. I would also let people know that when the President threatens to veto defense appropriations or to veto the NDAA, after we met his budget request, the world is listening to that, and it doesn't help the situation at all. This is an important issue. We need to unwind the defense sequester permanently, and certainly I support that. But the reality is, every year we reauthorize the Department of Defense. Every year we appropriate funds for the Department of Defense. This meets that same situation. My question is, when I heard General Greaves talk about technical maturation, that's step one, and risk reduction as part of step one, rocket propulsion system investment as step two, launch systems investment as step three. This sounds an awful like the same process that Dr. Griffin went through with COTS. And my question for you, Dr. Griffin, is why is it inappropriate now, but it was appropriate then? Was the COTS program unsuccessful, which now we have commercial crew and commercial resupply? It seems like it's at least working. Why is this different?
Well, a major difference, I think, is in the amount of money involved. In the COTS program at NASA, now this is taking us back nearly 10 years, we allocated, as we intended, a fairly small amount of money across two providers, and the clear terms of the agreements were that there would be a very significant majority of corporate investment, was our plan at that time. The program did work. We got 2 new launch vehicles out of it, domestic launch vehicles, the Falcon 9 and the Orbital ATK Antares. I think it is a very different thing for the national security launch infrastructure to be told to purchase launch as a service, implying that there is an open market of providers from which the department can buy a launch on a marginal cost basis as if it were an airline ticket.
Real quick.
And then, oh, by the way, to be told that they have to fund the development of that capability.
Is that not what COTS was? COTS was the funding of the development, ultimately, right, that led to...
A small portion of the development.
So the level of the investment was...
Money matters. That's exactly right. The level of the investment matters a lot. When we established the COTS program, we wanted to see a major element of contractor skin in the game. We did not want the skin in the game to be entirely that of the government. If the government was going to fund it as a new development, then we should just do it as a prime contract.
Okay. I just have a few seconds left, and I just want to reiterate the point I made earlier, which is the Department of Defense will be fully funded, and the President needs to sign that into law. And I think it's critically important that we not, take risk of, shutting down the Department of Defense because the President believes we don't have enough money spent on the IRS or enough money spent on the EPA or the National Endowment for the Arts. That is not an appropriate thing to do, especially given the threats that we face in the world. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize Mr. Kaufman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Hyten, everyone appears to be in unanimous agreement on 2 points. First, that competition is good since it provides cost savings and resiliency. And Two, that we need to eventually transition off the Russian RD-180 engine. I'm very concerned we haven't rationally thought through that process and the timelines. In other areas of national defense, we would never consider phasing out a capability until we had confidence in a follow-on. We're not going to, for example, F-35 will be ready to fight before phasing out the F-16. You know, as a combat veteran, I would never advocate for the phase out of one weapon system until I was confident the follow-on system is operationally ready to support the mission. In this space launch arena, we are anxious to phase out the RD-180 engine without full confidence that a robust capability is ready to replace it. What is the department doing to ensure there is no gap in assured access to space between the time the Atlas and Deltas are phased out and the follow-on Vulcan and Falcon Heavy become operational?
So, Congressman, I agree with your overall assessment. It's the first rule of wing walking. You don't let go of the one hand until you got firm hold of the next hand. And I'm concerned we're about to let go of one before we have firm hold on the next. So I think it's very important that we logically transition off these capabilities. I think the efforts that General Greaves and the acquisition community have come up with to reach out to industry broadly, to come up with a competitive strategy that looks at that, to use different acquisition authorities to allow them to go as fast as the acquisition process will allow them to go, has been exactly the right thing to do. But I still am concerned is that if he does everything exactly according to plan and we get an engine by 2019, we still can't let go of the wing. And that's why the department has come back to you and requested the ability to continue to have RD-180s for that transition period, whatever that is. And I agree with that request.
General Hyten, if the supply of RD-180s were cut to less than 14 engines, what would be the practical result?
There's two possible practical results. Practical result number one is that ULA can no longer be competitive in a competitive market, and therefore they decide that they can't compete, and we move into another monopoly. The other is that the government, because of the assured access to space requirement, decides that can't be allowed to stand, and therefore for the transition period we decide to pay the premium and fly the Delta IV at a price point that will be significantly higher and pay the difference with the taxpayers' dollars.
Okay. General Hyten, what is the department doing, and Lieutenant General Greaves, you might want to comment on this too. What is the department doing to ensure you are not replacing a quote-unquote sole source provider with a different quote-unquote sole source provider?
Well, I think the whole approach that we're taking is to figure out how to develop the rocket propulsion system that will be available for the capabilities that we need in the future. We're going down that path so we can have that new rocket, whether it's Vulcan with the Atlas V upper stage or whether it's the Atlas first stage with the other pieces. We're going down that path. And we have a much healthier industrial base now. SpaceX is certified for an element of the capabilities now. So we have SpaceX that is out there. So we have capabilities out there if we can take advantage of all of those systems, and that's what our approach is trying to do.
And Congressman Coffin, we initiated this in earnest last August with a request for information from industry, and we've been working with them very, very closely. And the rocket propulsion system effort that's ongoing now, step 2 as we refer to it, the goal is to, based on what we gathered from industry on their capabilities across the board, to end up with an initial 4 potential candidates and then whittle it down to 2. So we are ensuring, based on the capability within the nation, that we will preserve assured access to space.
Assistant Secretary McFarland, would you like to comment further?
Exactly what the two gentlemen here said. The department's look at this is that here we are. We have not got the intellectual capital currently inside of our government, let alone outside in industry, to do a one-for-one replacement. The RFP that's out on the street is to grow that knowledge immediately under a special type of a acquisition tool, if you would, the OTA. It has in there logical steps that would say, okay, we can now see what is the quickest, clearest, most affordable way to get to closure. And at this time, that is, I think, the most prudent approach to doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Lamborn of Colorado for any additional questions he may have.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to follow through on a question I was asking earlier. And if I could just go down the line, starting with you, Ms. McFarland. And it has to do with questions I was asking to SpaceX. If they haven't submitted changes for the upgrade Falcon 9, then how can it be said that their system is certified for launch or eligible for competition on the EELV?
Well, post that hearing on March the 17th, they did come in with a statement of intent and indeed are working with the Air Force for the heavy launch, Falcon 9.
And the other point I'll say, sir, is that part of the transition phase of that is moving to the full thrust engines on their Merlin capability. Now that's a very similar process to what we went through on the Delta vehicle when we went from an RS-68 to the RS-68A. They actually work closely with us as they go through that. That's part of the normal process that we work with both Atlas and Deltas over the years. We've done that on the upper stage as well. Once we go through and certify the system, it's basically a baseline capability. And then as industry learns and develops new capabilities, they have to come back to us and demonstrate their changes that go through. And the lucky part is General Greaves is actually the certifier, so he can talk about all the details of that. So I'll pass it to General Greaves.
Congressman, as General Hyten said, the Air Force has designated my position as the certification official for new entrants. And as part of that, in assessing SpaceX's capability, we are working with them very closely. In fact, I co-chair meetings every 2 weeks at the Gwen Shotwell, Elon Musk level to assess the current status of what they have proposed and any changes that they are envisioning or have realized into their system to ensure it becomes certified in time. So in the end, we are well aware of proposed changes to the Falcon 9 1.1 system as part of the upgrade that was discussed in the other panel. We are daily, our teams, our organic government team, our FFRDC team, we're working with SpaceX to fully understand what it will take to accept those changes, whatever they may be, as a certified system. This is no different, sir, than we have done with ULA in the past. In fact, last December, when we flew the RL-10C, which is an upgraded second stage engine, we went through a significant effort with ULA ahead of time to understand the changes of that system, of that engine, what it would do to the system, and then certify for flight, which we did last December, and it flew very successfully for the first time. So today, as we speak, SpaceX has provided what changes they envision for the upgraded Falcon 9. We are daily in an intense effort with them to understand and hopefully certify that system.
And you mentioned test flights in the case of ULA. UAL. Will test flights be part of the protocol with SpaceX?
As a basis, yes, sir, but I'll use the RL-10C as an example. That engine was qualified as part of ULA's design and delivery process, and we flew it for the first time with an operational mission. It was a classified mission back in December. So it depends on the level, degree, amount, impact of the changes that we are looking at to determine whether or not it would require a reflight or test flight. And this is no different, sir, than what we've done historically with our launch providers.
And Dr. Griffin, would you care to comment?
I would agree with General Greaves with regard to certification of new capability. And in fact, I would say the idea that we fly a large number of repeated copies of rockets is something that may look true from the outside, but truthfully, it's rare to go very long in a string without upgrading or changing something about the rocket. So you're in this continual process of evolution. And certainly we don't do a non-value-added test flight, a whole separate test flight with no payload, merely because we go from an RL-10B to an RL-10C. You just wouldn't want to spend that kind of money. On the other hand, when you're fielding an entirely new rocket, you will do a couple of test flights typically before you put a valuable payload on it. So there's an informed engineering and program management judgment that has to be applied to determine when you're willing to risk an upgrade without a test flight and when you need a test flight because the upgrade is just so big that you don't want to risk the payload.
Okay, and for a couple of clarifications, Ms. McFarland, some people have made unhelpful comments out in the public that the money from the sale of the RD-180 engines goes to, quote, Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Can you clarify that, please?
Congressman, I can't say where the money goes. The government buys launch services from ULA, but I can state that on May the 6th of 2014, the U.S. Court of Claims received the opinion of the United States Department of the Treasury, the United States Department of Commerce, the United States Department of State, that the payments to NPO Urgamash do not directly contravene Executive Order 13661 at this time, and would inform the court in the case of such determination in the future had to be overturned. So from our perspective, we did exactly due diligence on this to ensure that those statements were not factual.
Well, thank you for your background work and for that clarification. And lastly, I'd like to clarify with you or possibly General Greaves. Reuters reported at one point that the contracting approach used by ULA to purchase RD-180 engines via RD Amros employed quote-unquote questionable contracting practices. Is that true?
Congressman, no. It followed the standard process where the Air Force procurement contracting officer, with advice from such agencies as the DCMA, DCAA, examined the contracting approach for both ULA and RD Amros, and they did a couple of things. They went through and essentially did a price analysis to assess whether or not the proposed prices we were paying were within historical bounds. They also took a look at, for instance, the RS-68, what it cost to produce that engine versus what we were paying for it for the Russian engines, and they correlated all this information. And there was also a should-cost study that was done. So in the end, all the steps were taken. The RD-180s procured on a fixed-price basis. So we followed all those rules, and we vehemently dispute the accuracy of that information.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, General Hyten and General Greaves, for your service to our country. Dr. Griffin, Ms. McFarland, thank you for helping our country as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging those questions.
Glad to. Appreciate the questions. You know, I mentioned this earlier, I think it was during our first panel, that the House version of the NDAA for 2016 in this subject matter area in the Senate language is different. So this will be a question for all the witnesses. Please comment on the impact of the current FY16 NDA Senate language regarding the prohibition of Russian rocket engines. Are 9 engines from the 2015 to 2017 timeframe enough to maintain assured access to space and keep competition going? Why does this issue need to be addressed now? Ms. McFarland.
No, it does not. We have in Block 1A multiple competitive launch opportunities that this would not allow us to have 2 viable competitors for.
General Hyten.
And then the follow-on to that is as we go to phase 2.
Well, first, do you concur with that?
I concur with what Ms. McFarland just said. And it goes further than that because my biggest concern is really when we get into phase 2, which is the period between 18 and 22, where we have approximately 28 launches that we are going to manifest. There would be no Atlases available to compete for those launches at that time. That brings the whole discussion that we had a little while ago about the viability of ULA to get through that period That's an even bigger concern for me as we get into phase 2.
So I want to make sure that, for the record, we understand both Ms. McFarland and General Hyten are saying that the 9 engines are not enough to maintain assured access to space.
Yes, sir.
Okay. General Greaves, you had something you wanted to say?
Chairman, I concur entirely, and it gets back to the entire discussion on whether or not ULA remains commercially viable to make the transition between today and 2022.
And that's important because?
Because they need the steady stream of revenue to.
I mean, in the big picture, we need to have two people that can.
Yes, sir. Assured access to space. Yes, sir.
And so we'd be falling down on our overall goals of making sure we maintain assured access to space by having 2 providers.
Yes, sir.
May I come in,
Dr.
sir?
Griffin, absolutely.
The requirement for 2 providers comes more out of, if you will, my era. Back in 1986, we lost in sequence a shuttle, a space shuttle, a Titan, an Atlas, and a Delta. And so by the second half of 1986, the United States had no access to space capability at all. From among the many recovery actions taken following the loss of Challenger, it was determined that we would, in the expendable vehicle arena, keep 2 independent paths to space at all times for national security purposes. That's now it's presidential policy for several past administrations, and it is law. And I think, although the history is now 30 years old almost, I think we depart from that at our peril.
Great. You know, one of the things you will hear from the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee is, well, you know, we can just rely on NASA to make sure we maintain this assured access to space. Do you concur with that interpretation of our circumstance, Ms. McFarland?
Sir, I do not. I am going to be visiting with NASA to see what they have in their SLS vehicle. From what I understand, and I'm sure General Greaves and Hyten can explain further, it is a very costly way to send up an asset given what we have to do for our mission manifest.
Great. General Hyten.
NASA uses Atlas and Delta for most of their scientific missions today. They're working down a couple of other paths. The Space Launch System, the SLS program, is a giant rocket that's built for interplanetary exploration. It is not built to put satellites in low Earth, medium Earth, and geosynchronous orbit. So the good news is we meet with NASA, the Air Force, and the NRO all the time to talk about the partnerships. And we have great technology partnerships, but they do not have a rocket system that would meet our requirements.
General Greaves.
Chairman Rogers, I concur with what's been said before. One additional note is that my position also functions as the flight worthiness certification official for every national security space launch. And that set of criteria that we use to, in fact, I sign letters for every one of them. That criteria that we use to certify missions that are ready to support national security space, in most cases, are somewhat different than what NASA uses because their risk tolerance is, in most cases, a little higher than ours because ours are low risk. So that would be a difference if we were told to go to NASA for these engines.
Dr. Griffin, you used to run NASA. Do you think we ought to be relying on NASA for our assured access to space?
I don't, because in actuality, as was said earlier, NASA relies on the Department of Defense for the procurement of Delta and Atlas launch vehicles for its own robotic payloads. The larger rocket, the SLS, to which General Hyten referred, is intended for human exploration of the solar system, which I devoutly hope we will resume. But to use it for unmanned national security launches is possibly somewhat equivalent to using an aircraft carrier to transport cargo across the ocean. It would be a bit of an overkill.
General Greaves, what is the estimated cost of your 4-part plan, including all necessary investments in engines, launch vehicles, and infrastructure? And what is the basis of that estimate?
Chairman, we do not have a final estimate, and a lot of it depends on the assessment that we're doing right now. We do have funding in the 16 PB to address step 2 and step 3 of the 4-step process, but we are looking to see what estimates we get, and we'll work that in future budgets.
Great. Dr. Griffin, what are your thoughts on the cost of the Air Force's four-part plan versus funding an RD-180 replacement for existing launch vehicles and infrastructure?
Well, as General Greaves just said, I can't know yet what the cost of the four-part plan will be. I will offer the opinion that I very strongly believe that the cheapest way for the United States to regain its national security launch independence is to re-engine the Atlas V. I said that in my testimony for the record. So I can't prejudice the outcome of a procurement process which is ongoing. Even though I'm not an attorney, I know that. But I do hope that the outcome of that procurement process results in a decision to re-engine the Atlas V.
Great. Ms. McFarland, what would it take to off-ramp the current Air Force plan to a path that is focused on developing an engine that complies with the law and without government development of a new launch vehicle?
I think that would be a good question to ask us after we have a chance to review what's been proposed from the Air Force's current solicitation. I think that would be a good question for the record, and I think that would be a good product.
Great. General Greaves, you stated in your testimony that, quote, a rocket engine specifically engineered to replace the RD-180 on the Atlas would most likely be usable only for ULA's Atlas, close quote. However, according to press reports, Orbital ATK wanted the RD-180 so much they sued ULA to get access to it. That suit was settled out of court, and Orbital went with another Russian engine, but isn't it reasonable to conclude that the RD-180 would be flying on an Atlas and Antares today if Orbital had access to the RD-180?
Chairman, the answer is yes, but I believe I also said is that without significant modification to the receiving launch system, the launch vehicle. So yes, the RD-180 could be transitioned to another launch system, but it would come with mods.
General Hyten, there are claims that industry doesn't need any money to get off the RD-180 or the solutions are fully funded. In your judgment, can we just rely on industry to provide us the capabilities we need for our military? In the end, will the government need to pay for its requirements?
No, we can't, Congressman, in my opinion, and I think Mr. Griffin, or Dr. Griffin answered this well earlier when he talked about the business case that's really out there. And if you look at the business case is national security space launches, which means this is a national security mission, which means we need to be able to fund the critical elements of the industrial base to make sure that it's there. And right now, that element of the industrial base is not there to support where we need to go in the future. I think it's the responsibility of the Department of Defense and the government to make sure that industrial base is there for national security.
Excellent. I have many more questions, but I'm going to submit them to y'all to get back to us for the record because it is noon and we have worn out our welcome with y'all, I'm afraid. But I very much appreciate your time and effort. You have been enormously helpful to us, and I look forward to our continuing effort to get off this RD-180 and onto a new path of independence. With that, this hearing is adjourned.